examining the President's fiscal year 2024 budget proposals for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and Power Marketing Administrations. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. I also ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mass, be allowed to participate in today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. It's important that Congress exercises its oversight authorities over the executive branch. One of the ways to do this is to have agencies explain their budgets and their missions, and that's why we're here today. This subcommittee has broad jurisdiction, as is evident by today's witnesses. Before us today, we have the Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the 4 Power Marketing Administrations. Each of these agencies impacts the lives of Americans daily. In fact, the majority of these agencies have a direct impact on my constituents. Might come as a surprise, but sometimes these agencies have a hard time communicating, and in some cases, their opinions conflict with each other, especially when it relates to the Endangered Species Act. Over the past 20 years, Democrat and Republicans have spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to fix complicated situations like the Klamath River Basin in my district. Unfortunately, I don't know one person who has said that such efforts have worked or who can point to quantifiable benefits, but perhaps I'll hear otherwise this morning. People, including the agencies before us today, have to come to the table to help find lasting solutions so we are not left paying for solutions that never seem to happen. The status quo isn't working, at least in the Klamath, and I venture to say it's not working in other places throughout the West. These agencies and Congress can do better. While it appears that, fortunately, our water situation along the West Coast, and particularly in California and the Klamath, has improved, we still need long-term solutions, and I know each of you will be commenting upon your concepts of how we're going to achieve them. But what I'll be listening for, among other things, when it comes to the Bureau of Reclamation, and I'll just mention a couple of things as I was going through the reports that it has prepared. There are 489 dams over which it has jurisdiction. 361 are labeled high and significant hazard projects. It's obvious in the little part of Oregon that I live in that these dams are extraordinarily important, but they're all extraordinarily old. And so I'll be anxious to hear what is being done in regards to trying to maintain them. I'm sure we'll get to hear a lot about the so-called bipartisan infrastructure plan, but I'm much more interested in exactly how that money is being spent. In regard to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I'm extremely interested in how the money is being spent on the Klamath, the $162 million that was allocated, 30-some million of each year over the next 5 years. Very interested in hearing how that is being invested and how it's being spent. And of course, not to leave NIMS out, I'll just say I'll be anxious to hear the actual consequences and success stories of recovery when it comes to the amount of money that we're spending. I note in reviewing these reports that they are prospective for the most part. And that's fine. You're asking for money for next year, and so why wouldn't you be talking about what you're going to do with it next year? But I'd sure like to hear from you today on what you accomplished last year and, of course, what you're doing this year. And in other words, we need to share with the American people the benefits of the massive amounts of money we're spending in these spaces. I also, when it comes to U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I note on the very first page, there is discussion about, quote, accelerating and improving environmental reviews in support of responsible development of priority infrastructure projects and energy solutions. I was taken aback a bit about the use of the word responsible, but you can explain that, what you meant by that. But what's really important is that as we hand more money to you to make these systems work better, that they actually do work better and the money's not used to further delay what actually needs to be done and what the American people have asked be done. With that, I will turn this over to the ranking member for his opening statement, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the representatives from our federal agencies for joining us today to discuss budget requests for the next fiscal year. This is obviously an important part of the work that Congress does. How we go about this work, the decisions we make, will affect millions of Americans, our nation's economy, and our valuable fish, wildlife, and natural resources. So with that in mind, it is important to acknowledge that we are not having this conversation today in a vacuum. There is context. At the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, House Republicans are proposing draconian budget cuts that would slash agency budgets, wreak havoc on agency operations, and stunt our country's ability to meet climate and conservation goals. If we are serious about protecting species, recovering ecosystems, and helping communities combat climate change, we must adequately fund our federal agencies in these regards. Now, the budget cuts that are being proposed would hinder recovery of vulnerable species and their habitats. They would limit scientific advancements and cause permitting delays by gutting agency staff and resources needed to effectively and efficiently process permit applications. Let me remind folks again, last Congress, Democrats secured more than $1 billion to finally address the staff shortages and challenges with resources that are such an important part of slowing down permitting review by federal agencies. This Congress, we hear a lot about the term permitting reform. We hear it over and over. But our Republican colleagues have no new ideas. It's the tired old attacks on environmental laws and no acknowledgement of something that we're already hearing from agencies and project developers that is making a difference and moving these reviews faster. Finally, the fact that we allocated funding for these environmental reviews last year. So, look, we know that a major cause of permitting delay is the limited capacity to process permits, market risk, and financing. These are all things we addressed in legislation in the last Congress. Unfortunately, our friends across the aisle voted against this legislation and now are trying to repeal it and claw back much of that funding. So our Republican friends need to decide, do they want to move projects faster or play politics? That is part of the context of this conversation today. Now, the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA need adequate funding to process permits and conduct consultations for the many new clean energy and infrastructure projects funded by the IIJA and IRA. That's why their proposal to allow IIJA funding to be transferred into their agencies for permitting needs is so important. Let me take a moment to address another important issue that we've yet to see action on in this subcommittee, climate change. Most of us agree that this is a crisis that urgently needs to be addressed. It affects every single part of our country, but the chair of the committee has not yet responded to our request in writing, sent in March, that this committee have a hearing on the most important issue of our time and a recent report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Instead of facing this issue head on, House Republicans prefer to use our country's debt ceiling as a leveraging opportunity to double down on fossil fuel pollution and to make the climate crisis worse by passing huge new giveaways to big oil. That is part of the context of our conversation today. The Republican budget proposal would slash resources for NOAA. Cutting their budget means cutting funding for essential research on the impacts of climate change to agriculture, natural resources, and inland and coastal communities. Their proposal also cuts coastal resiliency funds that helps communities prepare for and recover from the ever-increasing storms and natural disasters that their carbon pollution is causing, as well as funds used to manage fisheries that feed our nation. Let me emphasize, nothing in NOAA's portfolio is optional. We're talking about essential weather forecasting, fishery science. Cutting NOAA's budget means cutting services that make our country safe and boost economic activity. Likewise, for the Bureau of Reclamation, it means cutting drought response and climate resilience projects that we need to stretch our available water supply. Last Congress, we provided significant new authorities and investments for the Bureau to support climate resiliency through, I'll call it the infrastructure law. We usually call it the bipartisan infrastructure law, but in this committee, it was not bipartisan, except for the great Don Young, the only one who voted for it in the Natural Resources Committee, and also the Inflation Reduction Act. So I look forward to hearing more today about how the Bureau plans to build on that work over the next fiscal year, if Congress will let them. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Heffman. I'm pleased to welcome the Chair of the Full Natural Resources Committee, Bruce Westerman, and I recognize him for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Bentz. And in light of Mr. Huffman's testimony, I would say that we have had several hearings that addressed climate. We talked about using clean American energy. We talked about permitting reform so that we could build new distribution systems so that we can not be reliant on Chinese supplied materials. We do it cleaner and better and with less emissions here in the U.S. than any place else in the world. And we gave our colleagues across the aisle an opportunity to vote on good energy policy that would be good for our economy and for the global climate, and they chose to vote no on that. So I guess it's a matter of perspective, but Chairman Bentz, thank you for holding this hearing today. Thank you to the witnesses for being here from the Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge, the Hollow Bend National Wildlife Refuge in my congressional district, and the nearby red snapper fishery in the Gulf of Mexico, to Alaska's longline fishing industry, to California's Central Valley Project, to the Chesapeake Bay. The agencies before us today have a profound impact on the daily lives of all Americans. The agencies play a vital role in our recreational pursuits, including hunting and fishing. They deliver water to Western farms so Americans can have access to American-grown fruits, nuts, vegetables, and other foods. They help create working waterfronts. They deliver clean, renewable, and emission-free hydropower generation to millions of electricity ratepayers across most of the nation, and they provide jobs to our communities. But what they give, they can also take away, and the agencies can contradict each other at times. This is why it's so important that Congress have oversight on these agencies. We could discuss hundreds of matters today, but I want to focus on just a few. The first one is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that manages 560 national wildlife refuges across the country. They talk a good game when it comes to allowing hunters and anglers to access many of these lands and waters. Yet in reality, it has already begun the process of phasing out lead ammunition at some refuges and is entertaining the notion of blanket lead bans across the entire refuge system. These increased costs will only decrease hunting and angling participation. At the same time, the service has proposed new endangered species listings that will do little but hinder non-federal conservation activities and do nothing to protect species. In reality, many of the policies that U.S. Fish and Wildlife promulgates and many of these species listings actually do more harm to species than they do good. And if we really care about endangered species, we've got to get away from this mindset of preservation and start practicing real conservation like was set out in the Endangered Species Act of 1973. NOAA's testimony barely touches on fisheries management, particularly red snapper, which many argue is a very abundant species in the Gulf of Mexico. You wouldn't know that from NOAA, which is not working adequately with Gulf states to incorporate data on how it counts the fish. At the same time, the agency is proposing draconian and unworkable boat speed measures on the Atlantic coast under the guise of protecting the right whale. This will devastate coastal communities and harm boating businesses and their workers without helping the whale. NOAA seems to be a boat lost at sea when it comes to the needs of these communities. That's why we've requested a GAO study on what's actually harming the right whales. There doesn't seem to be much of an outcry from the administration when we've had, 30 right whales wash up on the shore of New Jersey. I'm guessing had that been on the shore of Louisiana, there would be an outcry. On Western water, much of the West has experienced above-average precipitation that has led to full reservoirs and even flooding because of inadequate storage capacity. But as many know, we are one season away from another drought in these basins. The administration should provide a long-term strategy for avoiding the next drought, not just rationing or redistributing existing resources, or as we see in news releases this morning, paying off states in the Colorado River system to not use water with tax dollars that have been collected from across the country. At the same time, the administration is working on proposals that undermine longstanding hydropower generation in the Snake River and Colorado River basins. All of these lost energy costs will be paid for by electricity ratepayers. Many of the agencies before us have received steady budget increases over the last few years without even adding the massive amounts of funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Yet there seems to be no grand plan about how to plan for the future and provide certainty to people, species, and our environment. It's more like moving deck chairs around on the Titanic. I'm hoping today that we'll have a dialogue on how we can work collaboratively towards a better future, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Westerman. I'll now introduce our witnesses. The Honorable Camille Tootin, Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation in Washington, D.C., Mr. John Hairston, Administrator and CEO of the Bonneville Power Administration in Portland, Oregon, Ms. Tracy LeBeau, Administrator and CEO of the Western Power Administration in Lakewood, Colorado, Mr. Mike Way, Administrator of the Southwestern Power Administration in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Mr. Virgil Hobbs, Administrator and CEO of the Southeastern Power Administration in Elberton, Georgia. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow, and at the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I also allow all witnesses to testify before member questioning. I now recognize Commissioner Tootner for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Westerman, Chairman Bentz, Ranking Member Huffman, Congresswoman Napolitano, and the members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to discuss President's budget for the Bureau of Reclamation. Reclamation is grateful for its working relationship with the subcommittee, and I have had the privilege to serve as professional staff in this subcommittee for 4 Congresses. It's good to be home. The Bureau of Reclamation is the largest supplier and manager of water in the nation, the 2nd largest producer of hydropower. Reclamation's mission supports $66.5 billion in economic activity and supports 472,000 jobs. Meeting our mission means addressing drought resilience, water security, climate change adaptation, ecosystem health, and issues of equity. The need to maintain and modernize our nation's water infrastructure is an administration priority. We have a once-in-generation opportunity to utilize our fiscal year 2024 $1.4 billion budget request with that of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. The issues we face today, as many of you have said, are unprecedented as we experience the worst drought in the 120-year history of this organization. Record snowfall across parts of the West this year, and particularly in California, have brought some relief, but are not a resolution to our years, if not decades-long drought. Snowpack is 161% of average in the Colorado River Basin, but the reservoirs are collectively at 36% of capacity. In California's Central Valley, we experienced the 3 driest consecutive years on record, only to be followed with over a dozen atmospheric rivers this year. The cyclical nature of Western hydrology highlights the need for immediate actions, as well as thoughtful planning and on-the-ground work to make both our infrastructure and operational decisions more resilient to withstand future water resource scarcity and variability. Reclamation's 24 budget reflects a commitment to drought planning and response activities that promote water security, grounded in partnership and collaboration. No basin illustrates this strategy more than the Colorado River, where yesterday we were able to announce significant progress on a framework with the lower basin states to protect the stability and sustainability of the Colorado River system. And per the request of all the basin states, Reclamation will carry forward and analyze this proposal under the supplemental environmental impact statement. And appropriately, this budget request acknowledges the need to build on short-term system conservation with a focus to mitigate the impact of drought by implementing projects like aquifer recharge and storage that will build long-term resiliency, with $24 million included in Reclamation's drought response program. This funding supplements the $4 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act, allowing us to continue and focus on the majority of our funding for long-term investments. We must also plan for the future of our infrastructure. Reclamation's dam and reservoirs, water conveyance systems, and power generating facilities serve as the water and power infrastructure backbone of the American West. However, as with all infrastructure, these features are aging and need of critical maintenance. Our 24 budget request includes $105.3 million for extraordinary maintenance, combined with our bipartisan infrastructure law investments of $825 million in fiscal year 22 and $585 million for 23. We are constructing our largest dam safety modification project ever at the BF6 Dam in California, $100 million, supported by a FY 2024 Dam Safety Program request of $210 million. This funding not only addresses BF6 Dam, but also El Vado in New Mexico and 10 additional projects across the West. We are able to leverage this funding more effectively to address West-wide needs in an accelerated manner due to the $500 million in safety of dam funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law. Reclamation will continue to manage the drought in real time and plan for the future with a focus on people, partnerships, and investments. And we are committed to working with Congress and our partners and stakeholders in carrying out that mission, and our fiscal year 2024 budget supports these actions. I again thank the subcommittee, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. I now recognize Mr. Hairston for 5 minutes.
All right. Good morning, Chairman Benz and members of the subcommittee. I'm John Hairston, Administrator and CEO of the Bonneville Power Administration based in Portland, Oregon, and serving the Pacific Northwest. My written testimony on Bonneville's performance and initiatives reflects the dedication of staff and leaders who have met the challenges of the last 3 years with dedication and resilience. I ask that to be entered into the record. It is my pleasure to share Bonneville's financial performance remains strong. We expect to end the fiscal year 2023 in a healthy position despite this year's early runoff and high market prices. With ample reserves, careful financial management, the nation's leading credit rating agencies recently confirmed our financial strength. Further evidence of Bonneville's financial performance is our proposal to hold power and transmission rates flat for fiscal years 2024 and 2025. BPA's financial strength allows us the opportunity to meet the growing demand for new transmission service. With $10 billion in additional borrowing authority provided by Congress in the IIJA, Bonneville is positioned to support the regional economic development we see in our customers' transmission requests. Through our annual method of processing these requests, we have identified a group of priority expansion projects that are in various stages of development. Some of these projects will move new clean energy resources from east of the Cascades to population centers in the west. Other projects support new economic development in areas such as Tri-Cities, Washington, and Eastern Oregon. We are also developing new approaches to grid planning and expansion. We are starting with modifying the way we process generation interconnection requests, of which we see unprecedented demand. As such, we are looking at options to prioritize the generation projects that are ready for interconnection. On the power side of our business, we are planning for the next 2 decades of service to utilities through long-term power sales contracts. With current contracts ending in 2028, we are working closely with customers to develop the next generation of power sales policy and contracts. In addition, we are looking at expanding electricity markets to enhance the delivery of reliable, affordable hydropower. Last May, Bonneville joined the Western Energy Imbalance Market, or EIM, which helps optimize surplus capacity and load service. Any revenues generated by our EIM participation will help us keep power rates low. Moreover, we are now engaged in the development of a new day-ahead market opportunity, one being developed by the California Independent System Operator and the other by the Southwest Power Pool. We see a lot of potential value in day-ahead markets as a way to provide more efficient use of generation and transmission across the West. We have contributed funding to the next phase of SPP's day-ahead market development and remain engaged in the development of the Cal ISO market as well. Our goal is to have 2 viable options to consider before making a choice to join either market. Bonneville also played a leading role in the development of the Western Resource Adequacy Program, or WRAP. This program is a major step towards ensuring reliability while utilities across the West integrate new clean resources into the grid. Bonneville worked diligently to ensure that the program is consistent with our preference obligations. The 2022 Water Resources Development Act directed the Corps to conduct disposition studies for power purposes at 8 Willamette dams. Bonneville estimates that power production from Willamette Valley systems will be even more uneconomical with the diminished operations and additional structural costs proposed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Bonneville is eager to complete the disposition studies for consideration by Congress, and BPA's exceptional performance during the recent challenging years is a testament to and would not have been possible without our highly skilled workforce. So it is of great concern that competition for talent in the electric power industry is increasingly difficult under federal general schedule and government classification standards. Hiring and compensation approaches outside of Title V need to be explored. I am proud of the accomplishments of our people and their ongoing dedication to delivering tremendous value to the communities and economies of the Pacific Northwest. We remain committed to meeting our statutory obligations through sound business principles, environmental stewardship, and financial discipline. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony, and I will be happy to respond to any questions by the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I now recognize Ms. LeBeau for 5 minutes.
Hi, good morning, and thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Tracy LeBeau, Administrator for Western Area Power Administration. I'm pleased to be here. WAPA is amongst the nation's largest transmission owners and providers, covering a footprint of spanning across 15 western states. We market power from 57 federal hydroelectric projects, delivering it through our 17,000 miles of high-voltage transmission. WAPA's 1,900 employees and contractors work tirelessly and with great pride to keep the lights on for the 40 million Americans we and our customers serve. Together, we deliver on our mission to safely provide reliable, cost-based hydropower and transmission. The challenges and opportunities we face today and have been facing for a while, I'm going to discuss today. In 2022, drought threatened WAPA's entire service territory for the first time. As a start, WAPA convened and continued a dialogue on drought impacts on power with our federal partners and our most affected Colorado River Basin customers in order to listen and to share and to seek solutions together. While conditions have improved in the last 6 months, the mega drought remains akin to a slow-moving natural disaster. We've cut costs, and we've also raised rates only as necessary to maintain reliability, and we continue to plan for the probable as the overall trajectory of the drought is expected to continue. Reduced hydropower has also resulted in increased replacement power purchases on the market. We have seen increased costs and market supply risk for us and our customers. Incidentally, many of whom serve the most rural and economically vulnerable communities in the West. WAPA's Purchase Power and Wheeling Authority is an important financial guardrail against drought as it funds these replacement power purchases. At this time, WAPA projects its fiscal year-end reserves to be 39% below target. In the first half of FY23, purchase power and wheeling costs were 40% higher than the same time the year prior. We fully recover all costs through customer rates, and thanks to your support of our purchase power and wheeling program, we were able to mitigate economic impacts to our customers. In 22, WAPA also experienced an increase in other extreme weather events, resulting in damage to lines and facilities and exacerbated by supply chain and resource challenges. We have repaired and we've replaced, but those issues remain material risks that we are tracking on closely. And as you know, our core mission is providing safe and reliable electricity. As such, WAPA continues to operate and maintain our grid to high standards, and when needed, we also rebuild and upgrade our lines, and we are pursuing innovative ways to do so. One example is our recent announcement with Tucson Electric Power to partner on our Vail to Tortolita project, demonstrating how to rebuild and improve reliability without raising WAPA's rates. It is a model for future large-scale public-private partnerships. Innovative partnerships are also opportunities. Our transmission infrastructure program, which manages WAPA's $3.25 billion borrowing authority, is uniquely positioned to support new and expanded transmission in the West. TIP stands ready with projects at various stages of development. Energy markets can also enhance how we reliably deliver power in a dynamic energy landscape. WAPA was the first PMA to fully join a regional transmission organization, or RTO, in 2015. Today, we're involved in and exploring every major market initiative in the Western Interconnection. As of last month, WAPA now participates in real-time energy imbalance markets across our entire footprint as these markets can improve resource availability and facilitate integrating renewables into the grid. And WAPA is currently seeking public comment on whether to explore expanding full membership into the Southwest Power Pool's RTO, that decision coming this summer. Physical security is increasing concern to the grid. We continue to harden our federal assets from physical and cyber risks. Although there's no specific physical risk to WAPA at this time, we increased our security posture this winter in response to increased attacks across the country. And in the cyber realm, on average, our firewalls block almost 7 million actions per day. We remain vigilant 24/7, 365, and I'm proud of the work our cyber teams do to keep our systems safe and secure. With that, I'll conclude my remarks and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LeBeau. I now recognize Mr. Way for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I'm Mike Way, Administrator of the Southwestern Power Administration, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. For 80 years, Southwestern has worked with its partners to market and deliver low-cost, clean, renewable, emissions-free federal hydropower in the Southwest region. As one of 4 power marketing administrations in the nation, Southwestern markets a little over 2,000 megawatts of hydroelectric power from 24 multi-purpose projects owned by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. On average, Southwestern sells about 5.6 billion kilowatt hours of electricity each year with annual revenues of about $200 million. We also operate and maintain a high voltage transmission system along with line protection and communications components to keep our infrastructure secure. We have 102 wholesale customers in Arkansas, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Texas, and Oklahoma, which serve over 10 million end users in our footprint. Southwestern and its customers depend on water in the reservoirs to generate hydropower, and that water comes almost exclusively through rainfall. Our long-term storage is limited, and when it rains, the hydropower flows, but when it's dry, Southwestern must rely upon power purchase agreements to meet our contractual obligations to our customers. We plan for contingencies like drought, but having reliable funding is an important aspect of that planning. Southwestern's been fortunate to have our program funded through a combination of appropriations and congressional authorities, providing us the opportunity to operate according to sound business principles. To fund our purchases, we have historically relied upon congressional authority to use receipts over the long term across good water years and bad. Prior year balances have been available to Southwestern so that we are financially prepared and able to achieve rate stability for our customers. Last year's enacted budget provided Southwestern such authority, and it was the first time in 5 years that it had been granted. The President's fiscal year 2024 budget proposal before you today seeks a continuation of that authority. As I mentioned, a critical part of operating and maintaining a high voltage system is keeping the infrastructure secure. Southwestern's efforts on this front begin first and foremost with our commitment to safety and to fostering a work environment that is healthy and free of uncontrolled hazards and unsafe work practices. I'm proud to report that just this month we received a Safety Award of Excellence from the American Public Power Association recognizing Southwestern's safe working environment. Our staff works around the clock to make sure our systems are secure and available to support not only Southwestern and its customers, but also the electrical grid that is vital to our nation's energy security. Hydropower generators respond quickly to changes in electrical demand and provide valuable and flexible support to the bulk grid in times of crisis. 2 recent examples are Winter Storm Uri in February 2021 and Winter Storm Elliott in December 2022. In both these cases, Southwestern worked with its customers to reduce electrical demand so that hydropower generators could be used for critical voltage support to stabilize the grid. While we count on hydropower generators to continuously perform, we also realize that long-term investment is what will keep them operating and available over the next few decades. Southwestern and its ratepayers have facilitated over $1.1 billion through our customer funding program to fix and replace components such as turbines, generators, related equipment at Corps-owned plants. Mr. Chairman, I want to take the opportunity to thank you, the the members of the subcommittee, and all the members of Congress who directly represent the beneficiaries of the Federal Hydropower Program for your partnership. Southwestern's request for appropriations for fiscal year 2024 is $11.44 million, which represents only 6% of Southwestern's entire budget. We plan to use our authority for offsetting collections and alternative financing to make up the remainder of our request. This concludes my testimony, and I'd be happy to address any questions that you or the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Way. I now recognize Mr. Hobbs for 5 minutes.
Subcommittee Chair Bentz and Ranking Member Huffman and members of the committee, I'm Virgil Hobbs. I'm the Administrator of Southeastern Power Administration. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you this morning Southeastern's fiscal year 2024 budget request and information about our program. From our headquarters in rural Elberton, Georgia, Southeastern personnel proudly market and deliver reliable, cost-based federal hydroelectric power from 22 multipurpose projects operated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Southeastern's 11-state service area is Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia. In fiscal year 2022, Southeastern sold nearly 7.5 billion kilowatt hours of carbon-free energy to 472 wholesale public body and cooperative customers with benefits reaching over 12 million consumers. Southeastern's fiscal year 2024 operating budget request of $94.4 million results in a net appropriation of $0. Rates charged to our wholesale customers recover all of Southeastern and core costs allocated to power. FERC confirms Southeastern's proposed interim rates on a final basis for a 5-year term. Marketed system rates are reviewed annually to ensure revenue is adequate to meet repayment obligations. Southeastern does not anticipate proposing any new rates until the Cumberland and Carr-Philpott electrical systems reach full term in 2025. Federal hydropower must remain a viable part of our customers' energy resource portfolios. As the energy landscape in the Southeast evolves, variables including the formation of the Southeast Energy Exchange Market, reduction in base load coal generation, new nuclear power delays, volatile natural gas prices, and alternative intermittent renewables have made affordable, reliable federal hydropower vitally essential to our customers. Southeastern's ability to consistently deliver energy, especially through Winter Storm Elliott in December 2022, has earned high praise and appreciation from our patrons. A Virginia municipal customer prodded Southeastern to begin an effort to provide renewable energy certificates, or RECs, inherent with hydropower generation. Since December 2020, Southeastern has transferred 2.3 million validated RECs to our North Carolina and Virginia customers of the Carr-Philpott system. Southeastern's process of revising the 3 remaining power marketing policies to include REC distribution will conclude this year. The potential REC volume is 6 million annually, and all of Southeastern's customers are extremely grateful to be accessing this additional economic benefit of federal hydropower. The Water Resources Development Act of 2000 enabled hydropower customers to fund core hydropower infrastructure reliability improvements. Since inception in 2004, Southeastern has conveyed $819 million of energy and capacity sales receipts to accomplish generation replacements and renewals. Southeastern's Cumberland system customers have agreed to fund $1.2 billion of planned rehabilitations of all 28 generators of the Corps' Nashville district. The first 3 generator replacements are complete, and contracts to rehabilitate 7 more have been awarded. Customers have authorized $24 million to install a dissolved oxygen injection system upstream of the 312-megawatt Wolf Creek project to regain year-round full power output by providing downstream fish-friendly habitat. Southeastern maintains strong cooperative working relationships with our preference customers and core partners. Future success of the federal hydropower program relies on the success of these relationships and our ability to find solutions to complex challenges threatening the program through higher costs and reduced generation capability. Over the past 6.5 years, the Power Marketing Administrators have met with Corps Commanding Generals to discuss topics critical to the sustainability of our jointly managed federal hydropower electric system. These progress must still endure, and meaningful change must be achieved in key areas if substantial planned reinvestment in these federal renewable assets can continue in these times of competitive and dynamic markets. Finally, I'd just like to thank the dedicated and important civil service of the Southeastern Power Administration employees, and thank you again for this opportunity to testify before you today.
Thank you, Mr. Hobbs, and I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. We will now recognize members for 5 minutes for questions. We'll begin with Mr. Lamalfa. Mr. Lamalfa, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our panelists for being with us here today. I appreciate the opportunity. Commissioner Tootin, you'd mentioned in your comments there three lumps of dollars there for, I think, for storage refurbishment. It adds up to about $1.5 billion. Is that going to be able to be carried out timely so that we don't lose opportunities for storage or lose the facilities themselves?
Good morning, Congressman. Thank you for that question. We are absolutely motivated to be able to put that money into action and on the ground. We've invested $515 million in storage projects in California alone, and it's our intention to move those as expeditiously as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears to also the Upper Klamath Lake. You knew that was coming.
I did.
In April this year, it was announced that BR would be allocating about 215,000 acre-feet of water for use of farms and ranches there, which we're grateful for. It's better than what's been going on recently, and as well as helping out with the refuges. However, in the big picture here of the water, amazing water availability, the snowpack we've had this year and the rain, all around the state, it was indeed a disappointment because it is half of their historical need and use. So I saw a recent update, I think Friday, that an extra either 45 or 50,000, I'm hearing different numbers, but it's going to bring up to either 260 or 265.
65.
And do you know which figure that is?
At 265, Congressman.
265, okay. Again, thank you for the update on that. I'm still wondering though, is this, I think you could have justified an even higher number with the positive condition the lake is this year. So why couldn't it have been even a higher number, such as 285, that growers are looking at up there to have a more normal crop year?
I can't think of any basin better represented on the subcommittee than the Klamath Basin, and fully recognize that the challenges are real there. One of the things we're watching is how the snow melts. While it's there as snow, in past years, we've seen the snow not materialize into runoff. And so when we were looking at our allocations, we wanted to be sure that that 265 would hold while meeting all the other requirements that we need to meet for the system.
Do you anticipate a further augmentation? Should it be more positive farther into the crop year? Such as last year, we made the appeal that there was extra water above the interim operating plan end of season number, and we couldn't, get any movement on the end of year. An extra irrigation would have helped a lot of growers up there when they had potatoes the size of your finger out there. We were looking about for 30,000 acre feet. So do you see that there could be an additional upgrade, say in June or what have you?
We'll adaptively manage the system, and I'm happy to follow up with you and keep you posted as we see the hydrology progress.
So can farmers and ranchers figure out how to plan for that in their crop year?
Which is why we wanted to be able to get the numbers out, just not in the allocations, but also for the environmental water account, to make sure that we're providing certainty as they're making business decisions and that the ecosystem is also protected.
Okay. Quickly on the lake elevation of 4139.2 seems to be a target number right now. I wonder what the significance of that number is, because it's moved around from biological opinion to interim operating plan. Is the suckerfish going to be in jeopardy at a number different than 4139.2, like 0.19 or 39.0, 4138, when even the irrigator's water right is all the way down to 4136?
So
I mean, what's the significance of that particular number?
As we're looking at managing the system, we're looking at the requirements, as you mentioned, Congressman, of the species. But as we looked to manage the system earlier this year, a commitment was to keep the lake as high as possible, not only for the species, but to ensure that we're going into the next water year.
Okay, all right. Because we know that this sucker actually thrives in lower water better than other types of fish. Let me point out real quick, I have on this chart here, in order for the long-term flows of the river to be strategized, they were using figures from the, called the Hardy Flow Study, using the highest possible numbers from 1904 to 1912 down here from the one of the wettest periods in the 123-year history, when you do have a lot of other low-flow years. So the target ends up being based on the super high-flow numbers from 100 years ago, as opposed to something a little more the average. So they can hardly meet the goals because the number's been set so high, the bar's set so high. So is this something that can be revisited here? Because indeed, a lot of us believe that this is an artificially high target to be met from something that happened. You know, you look at the whole chart here. You got these heavy zones here. None of them have been that heavy in the 100 years since.
So we are committed, and I've been out to the Klamath Basin 3 times since I've been in this position. We'll be there this summer on talking about what a holistic solution is for the basin. As it's been mentioned before, it's not sustainable, and we want to be able to provide certainty to the water users, but also protect the ecosystem. So
Okay, well, we have impossible numbers for the water users to meet out of their allocation, so I might need to yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamalfa. Ms. Napolitano, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you, Ms. LeBeau. And Mr. Ton, so happy to see you. Mr. Ton, the bipartisan infrastructure law included a new program from a bill that I authored to advance large-scale mega water recycling projects. Can you share upon what progress has been made so far to stand up this new program and when we can expect funds to roll out? And when do you expect the coming period to start on the draft criteria?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. I was so glad to be able to be with you in Orange County last year to announce the $309 million of water recycling under Title 16, 25 projects, 850,000 people's water supplies. What we're looking at large-scale water recycling is one project could meet those needs, just with one, as far as scale. So we're anticipating to release a request for proposal for construction of large-scale recycling later this summer. So stay tuned for that and look forward to working with you on that.
Great. Other areas are starting to look at the feasibility of starting those projects because it's going to be needed with the drought cycles we're having. And also, can you tell me, tell the committee how funding support for long-term solutions are desperately needed for address persistent water supply, and how can our investments from the law and Inflation Reduction Act support and address the long-term solutions?
So we have short-term investments in water grants, water smart funding for efficiencies. We've also been able to utilize, as we mentioned, $309 million for water recycling, 850,000 people, $515 million in storage in California, and being able to repair our infrastructure. $100 million for BF-CISC for earthquake safety. It also is south of Delta Storage and Essential Valley project. So I know I talked specifically about California, but that's across every single western state.
Well, do you have the 17 western states to worry about? What are the other states doing to address climate change and the water shortage?
The challenges in California are not unique to California. They're seen in every single basin. So we're utilizing the funding for an all-of-above approach. If water recycling makes sense, that's what we're spending money on. If efficiencies make sense, that's what we're doing. We're leading with our partners and making sure it makes sense on the ground.
I appreciate all your support, and thank you for doing the job you're doing on Bureau of Reclamation. I yield back.
Thank you. And I'll recognize Chairman Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bentz, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm a big fan of hydropower and appreciate what you all do. Would you all agree that hydropower is as clean a power as we can produce? Probably the cleanest power when you look at all the inputs and everything that are required for various forms of power. I was doing a little bit of back of the napkin math, and it looks like we've got about 102,000 megawatts of total hydropower, 80,000 megawatts capacity on conventional hydropower, and another 22,000 megawatts of pump storage. But if you just take the 80,000 megawatts and you look at 100% utilization of that, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, which I realize is not reasonable, you get a total capacity of about 780 terawatt hours of capacity across the country. Is my math in the ballpark on that? So and then I look back to see what the usage was on hydropower in our country, and we peaked out in 2011 at about 319 terawatt hours. So that's about 45% utilization of the peak capacity. 2022, we were only at 262 terawatt hours, which is down around 37% utilization of that peak capacity. So when we're in a world where we're wanting more carbon-free electricity on the grid, it seems to me that we would be trying to get every ounce of energy out of these hydro dams that we could. So I've also been doing a lot of field trips in my district. I went to a dam that I visited when I was in elementary school. It only has 2 turbines in it. It's there close to where I live in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and only 1 turbine was running. So I asked the dam operator, are you doing maintenance on the other turbine? They said, no, we just have it shut down. I said, well, why is it shut down? I thought dams were built for baseload power. They said, well, the Power Administration hasn't called for power from it. I said, oh, that's interesting. Why? So you're using this dam as peaking power? They said, yeah, basically that's what we're doing. I thought maybe that was just a one-off. Then I've traveled other places in the country. I was up on the Snake River at the, I think it's the Ice House Dam, the last dam on the river. They had 6 turbines and only 1 was running. And I asked the Corps of Engineers operators, why aren't the other 5 turbines running? Well, the Power Administration hasn't called for the power. I said, so you're using this dam as peaking power, and all this water was flowing past the dam that could have been turning every generator. And we did a little back of the napkin calculator there, and had all that water being used, it was passing through the dam to generate electricity. That system would have been producing more power than all the windmills and solar farms in Washington State combined. So my question is, are we using hydro dams as peaking power across the country now instead of baseload power for the most part?
I'll just say for the Southeast, and I know probably for the Southwest too, unfortunately, we don't have the water quantity to be able to base load our generation. So they are considered peak load assets, and we rely on other base load entities to take up that. And we do basically work the peak, and we do have 2 pump storage generation projects in our Southeastern footprint as well, so we utilize that as much as we possibly can.
So the engineer in me was asking the question, why would we be peaking with dams? And then I realized, we don't have battery storage for wind and solar. So is it true that you have to create space on the grid, basically where every electron that comes off a solar farm or a windmill has to go on the grid?
Yes, sir, I can speak to that. And I'm familiar with Blakely Mountain, the project that you toured in your district. Combination of wind, solar, fossil fuel plants, as well as the hydro. But the hydro is basically used as a super peaking resource across the highest peaks of the day. However, it is used also occasionally to back up some intermittent resources that fail to come online, such as some of the renewables that we have challenges with if there's a weather situation or something like that.
But with the demand for green energy, wouldn't it make more sense to utilize these hydro resources to get every ounce of energy out that we could? And I know there's a balancing equation that you have to do. You can't always take all the energy being produced, but it seems like we're almost offsetting hydro green power with wind and solar green power when we could be utilizing those together and getting more carbon-free electrons on the grid.
Sir, well, to address that, when you look at the Bonneville system, we have 31 hydro projects on the Columbia and Snake River. As you blend in more renewables utilizing that system, if it's wind and solar, like you say, when the wind isn't blowing, you don't have as much power. If the sun isn't out, you don't have as much solar, so you have to utilize something that's instantaneous to be able to fill in those peaks and valleys. And hydropower is really a valuable asset for doing that. Moreover, as you look at bringing in more renewables, you're really replacing or retiring coal and coal plants or carbon-based plants. So when you bring on those renewables to replace those plants, you still have to utilize the peaking capability of the hydro system to blend those resources in. So while it may sound like you can replace those carbons with the hydro capacity, you still need to have that capacity for emergency purposes as well as blending in those renewables.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make the point that we do sacrifice some hydropower for renewables. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Ranking Member Huffman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Touton, first of all, congratulations on your Colorado River agreement that we've been hearing about. Fingers crossed that that comes together and gets us through a couple of difficult years ahead, but that was certainly great news in the last couple of days. So as you know, the context for this budget conversation we're having today is that at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue, our Republican colleagues are proposing a freeze on discretionary spending at fiscal year 2022 levels for some period of time. We're hearing 10 years. Can you tell the committee what the harmful impacts would be for the public if Reclamation had to absorb budget cuts as big as what is being proposed?
Good morning, Ranking Member, and thank you for the recognition. So we develop our budget to be able to meet our mission of delivering water and producing hydropower. And within our discretionary budget, that's our operations and maintenance and our annual budget and incremental progress for the long term. When you couple that with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, that gives us the long-term planning and funding for that. When you look at cuts that we aren't unaccounted for to our FY24 budget, it has an impact on how we meet our mission. And meeting our mission means the ability to deliver water to 1 in 5 farmers, 40 million people in the Colorado River Basin, and produce power. So that has real impacts as far as cuts to our budget.
All right, thank you. Administrator Hairston, I was made aware of a recent white paper from the group called Renewable Northwest and others that discusses how the Bonneville Power Associate Administration can play a much more significant role to support the construction of regional transmission lines. The paper recommends a number of reforms that can be carried out under your existing legal authority to support greater transmission deployment. And it further states that we won't have the transmission capacity we need unless Bonneville makes some of these changes, including the fact that it relies too much on discrete customers right now to shoulder the financial cost of expanding the grid, among other problems. Are you familiar with the white paper? And could you speak to how Bonneville plans to meet the challenge of increasing transmission?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I'm relatively familiar with the white paper, but more importantly, what we're doing to expand transmission in the Northwest, I spoke to in my comments. We've got a number of projects that are underway that are leveraging or utilizing the funds that we received through the IIJA. We received $10 billion in borrowing authority, and right now we have close to about $2 billion worth of projects, in the works. A couple of them are the north and south of Cascades projects that are going to move renewable wind from the east to the population centers on the west. We also have reinforcement projects in the Tri-Cities area that is going to allow for a lot more capacity, close to 1,600 megawatts of capacity in that area. That's going to allow the flow of renewable power. So we are actively building new transmission, utilizing the new borrowing authority that we have. And we're also exploring other larger scale projects that will hopefully allow a lot more diversity in the system that will give us access to renewables outside of the region to improve our ability to meet help our customers meet their decarbonization requirements.
Appreciate that. Administrator LeBeau, can you speak to the same question from WAPA's perspective? What are you doing to support greater transmission deployment and accelerated transmission deployment?
Thank you. And thank you for the question. It's my favorite topic. We really want to build transmission, expand our footprint, not for the sake of it, but just there are some opportunities that we are pursuing together, like I mentioned during my comments, together partnering with some of our customers and some of the utilities in which we do business with. But there are also opportunities that we're looking throughout our footprint, our 17,000 miles, on if there's some strategic opportunities to either expand what we already have, where it fits a customer priority, or if there is from a reliability perspective. So we're really looking at congestion, relieving some congestion. That is one of our priorities. The other is really looking through our system and see if there's opportunities for expand or increased resiliency in our system. We are often challenged by extreme wildfires, extreme weather events, and so we've got a better sense of kind of where throughout our footprint we are seeing increased amounts of threats to our physical system. So those are also opportunities we're actively exploring as well.
All right, thanks very much. I yield the balance of my time, which is none.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Ms. Luna for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I'd like to yield my 5 minutes to Representative Lamatha.
Thank you, Ms. Luna, appreciate that. Just following back up, Commissioner Tootin, on the, I just wanted to revisit this as we ran out of time at the end, but here again, we're looking at the highest flows were between a short period of time right here, really between 04 and 12, and we're really baselining on a whole lot of decisions these days on a study that is based on an artificially high flow rate. So I think we really need to visit that in order to have fairness on what the flow should be for the rest of the system. So I'll leave it at that for right now. What I would like to know also, I'm going to ask this also of Fish and Wildlife when they get here in a little bit, but how do you balance the needs between what Fish and Wildlife wants versus NOAA or NIMFs, for example, on the suckerfish issue in the lake and the salmon downstream? They're all both trying to occupy the same space, it seems, keep the lake high or release a mass amount of water down the river to satisfy the ideals for the salmon.
So a lot of our ability to manage the system is to be able to work and coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. So when we looked at this year, we worked really hard, and it was before the atmospheric rivers that we saw in January. It was not looking good or positive for the lake or, frankly, for the lake. And so we were able to adaptively manage the system to be able to meet our requirements for that species. At the same time, when we saw more positive hydrology, we were able to update the environmental water account as well as the allocation. And I misspoke, Congressman, it's 260,000 earlier, so it's a 45,000 acre
It
foot
is 45,
increase.
thank you, all right.
But it really does involve not just us talking with nymphs and fish, but also talking with the water users and the tribal entities. And I think we're committed to be able to operate. Everyone's tired of year to year. What everyone wants to do is a longer term solution. This year provides us that ability to have a discussion about what is a longer term solution for the basin.
Okay, well, the model of reclamation is usually doesn't seem to allow for the storage due to the other demands, and it's really negatively affecting the refuges as well as obviously agriculture. Now this year we've had such tremendous amount of rainfall and such that it's made possible what hasn't happened the last couple of years on on agriculture. So agriculture's caught in the bind between these other factors, and indeed, we have to remember the Klamath project was created for agriculture, and it made available water that would not normally exist or have been available in any other way if that man-made project hadn't been done. So let me shift to an issue on funding. There's money the federal government is holding from the leased lands revenue that for Tule Lake that is supposed to be utilized for infrastructure repair. Do you know how much money is currently in that fund that hasn't been utilized yet?
I don't have those numbers in front of me, but I can follow up with you on the leased lands
Okay.
number.
I have an older number from 2020 that says it's about $80 million that's still tied up that could be helping with that infrastructure, as they've suffered a lot with dry ditches and such with the water not flowing normally, so repairs has to be done.
Okay.
My understanding, the Keno Dam is under ownership of Pacific Corps still, and that there is a large backlog of maintenance work to be done up there, that's a very important piece of this whole puzzle there. So wouldn't it be proper for Pacific Corps to pay for those improvements before that might change ownership hands?
So the management of Keno Dam, as you mentioned, is under Pacific Corps. When it does transfer, we will manage it in a short term as they are managing it, but part of those agreements include the ability to be able to transfer that facility.
Are they going to pay for the repairs first, though, before it would transfer?
I have to follow up on that.
Okay. Do you believe hydroelectric power, following up Mr. Westerman, is it important to our energy future in this area?
Is that to me, Congressman? Is that to me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, we need it. Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bentz. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I want to echo Ranking Member Huffman's congratulations on the Colorado River negotiations. I heard frequent prognostications that we would never be able to pull a deal together, and I'm really proud of how the Department of the Interior and all of the state commissioners, along with our tribal partners, worked diligently towards this outcome. It's a consensus-based approach, and I think that's really important. It was developed chiefly by the 3 lower basin states, California, Arizona, and Nevada, and it's not an agreement that's going to be all that long-lived through the end of 2026, but it's a great start. And I just want to point out that of the conservation savings, 2.3 million acre feet will be compensated through about $1.2 billion in federal funds that we secured through the Inflation Reduction Act. And then there'll be remaining system conservation through voluntary reductions. Really builds on other foundational investments in water conservation, like in San Diego County, where the 2003 QSA with the Imperial Irrigation District worked with these efforts to support the short term and improve system efficiency over the long term. We're going to need more action, but this was definitely a great achievement. Commissioner Touton, can you discuss the importance of the consensus-based approach and also specifically how funding from the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law impacted this outcome?
Thank you. The basin has had the long-standing history that the solutions should be grounded from the basin. And the framework that was provided by the lower basin, which we've been asked to analyze, is exactly that. It's 3 million acre feet over the next 3 years in voluntary conservation measures. And as you mentioned, Congressman, that's a short term, that's a bridge. What it allows us to do is provide certainty for the system in that short term, so we have the space to be able to talk about longer term solutions post-2026, which we will look to start later this summer. Regarding investments, you mentioned that, but later next month, we will be announcing what we're calling Bucket 2, which are the long-term sustainability programs under the Inflation Reduction Act for the Colorado River Basin. And so that looks at lining of canals, of perhaps re-reg systems to be able to manage water more efficiently in this dry climate. And within the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have spent a significant amount of that money, 101.73 billion in the Colorado River Basin of the 2.52 billion in bipartisan infrastructure law allocations. That's in water recycling, that's in aquifer storage, that's in small storage, that's in aging infrastructure. We're really proud of that, and we're able to make significant investments that we would have never been able to do.
Well, I appreciate that very much. It's an important accomplishment in Western water security, and I hope that it will help you, that consensus-based approach in particular will help you moving forward. With my remaining time, I want to briefly discuss desalination. Regional ocean water desal projects like the Doheny Desalination Project in my district in Dana Point, California, are of particular importance to coastal communities' ability to address drought. As I think you know, the bipartisan infrastructure law included historic funding for reclamation, including $250 million for desal projects, similar to the provisions in my Desalination Development Act. This February, I led a letter with Senators Feinstein and Padilla urging Reclamation to further incentivize regional desalination projects by lifting the $30 million per project administrative cap and allowing projects to receive federal funding up to the full statutory federal cost share of 25% of the total project cost. The administrative project funding cap disincentivizes regional cooperation projects that cost more than $120 million by providing a lower federal cost share than the statutory 25% rate. My question is, Reclamation considering raising or waiving the $30 million per project cap?
Thank you for your support of our desal projects and our program. That is something we're actively discussing now. It was something that we looked at on Title 16 water recycling as well. So I look forward to following up with you, but responding to your letter.
All right, I look forward to reading your response, and I thank you all for your work, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Radewigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Benz and Ranking Member Huffman, and to all of the witnesses for being here today. At this time, I'd like to yield to my colleague, Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Ms. Radewigan, appreciate it. Commissioner Toten. The question I have too on the Klamath Reclamation Project, we've been asking, numerous times over the years on the BOR, various administrations, how much is left for repayment of the debt from the people in the project to the government in order to assume the ownership of that project?
This is one of the first projects we have. I actually don't know the number to what's left of the repayment contract, so let me get that back for you. I don't imagine it could be a lot, given when it was constructed in 1908.
Yeah, thank you. We really been looking for that answer for some time here,
Okay.
so I know you've got a newer run at it here. What we have here is that KID, Klamath Irrigation District, they were at one time zero balance, paid in full status on, it says here, 4 May of 1965. And it was also confirmed in numerous correspondences between 65 and 85 as having been, again, paid in full. So the understanding of the original 1954 contract at that time is that the title would transfer to the district immediately upon completion of repayment. In 2002, the district requested title, and the government told the KID directors, Klamath Irrigation District, it would take still $2 to $5 million more at that point in 2002. So no further action appears to have occurred. Then their executive director, Mr. Gene Souza, submitted for title transfer in June of 2021, and Reclamation did not act for 6 months at that point. Director Souza resubmitted it in December of 2021. As of February of this year, Mr. Ernie Conant, the regional director, had not seen, been briefed, or had any knowledge of KID's request for title. So KID has been told it was going to be briefed with you since September of last year, and no action appears to be moving on that. So I guess from your previous question, have you been briefed at all about that?
I haven't been briefed in the sense of where the progress is on the title transfer, but I have heard the interest by KID for a title transfer.
Okay, all right. So when do you think we can resolve this issue? They've been asking again for a long time. You could say going far back as 20 years, and I think they've been faithfully keeping all their payments since then when there was seen to be a new balance, even though the number from 65 to 85 was zero balance. So
Title transfer is one of those programs that we're really proud of. Once we were given the authority under the Dingle Act, we've done 4 or 5 of them already during my tenure, and so it's something we take seriously. I have a lot of homework for you, so perhaps I can follow up on title transfer and the other questions next week.
okay, well, I appreciate that at least we're having this conversation about it here, because in the past, it seems like it wasn't getting through the process. So our direct conversation is
Sure.
indeed valuable on that.
Thank you.
Certainly. Okay. Now, there's this pending project to remove the lower Klamath dams. If this should come to fruition, if this idea is seen through, we're going to see decades worth of sediment released that is behind those dams. One figure has 20 million cubic yards. What I've observed in other dam removal projects is that the number is oftentimes very underrepresented. We've seen one case where it was actually triple what was estimated. So who knows how much sediment, and we know sediment is the enemy of fish spawning and the egg beds and all that. So what we might see here is that could NOAA determine that they need additional water to do these super flushes like they're doing right now in the Trinity River under their restoration program, super flushes? Is that water going to have to come even farther from the from farmers' allocation? And if they deem that, we messed up on the number of cubic yards and we're going to have to flush this sediment?
That's a conversation that we'll have with NOAA and the water users to see how we manage the system as it changes.
So we're going to walk into this dam removal with a complete unknown on what is going to be required for the flows. That's what I'm hearing. So not directed at you per se, Commissioner. So I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Macon Senior for 5 minutes.
Thank you all. You know, when I am back home in Rhode Island, one of the top issues that I hear about from my constituents is the price of food, which is too high for working people. And so, you know, some may wonder, why am I, as a representative of Rhode Island, so interested in Western water policy? It is because of that. It is because there is a direct link between the ability of my constituents to put food on their table and pay their bills with what is happening out west. And that is why it is important that we invest in the technology and the infrastructure to ensure that farmers and agricultural producers out west are able to affordably produce food for markets across the United States. I say this in the context of this week when, unfortunately, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have manufactured an artificial default crisis in order to try to force devastating cuts to federal agencies in order to pay for tax cuts that they lavished on billionaires and big corporations when they were in power a few years ago. And the implications of these cuts that they are trying to force on the American people impact constituents like mine and their ability to put food on the table. So, as I understand, and the ranking member alluded to this, the demand that is being put forward in exchange for not allowing the economy to implode is a return to fiscal 2022 funding levels in non-discretionary spending, which would be essentially a 20% plus cut to discretionary spending, including, Commissioner, to your agency. And so can we just hear a little bit more about what would the implications be if our colleagues across the aisle are successful in slashing funding for your agency in order to pay for tax cuts that were lavished upon billionaires and corporations? What would be the impact on your agency? What would be the impact on the farmers that you serve? What would be the impact on the small businesses who you serve? And what would be the impact on families like those who I represent back home?
Thank you for the question. Our budget is formulated in meeting our mission of delivering water and power across the West, which, as you mentioned, we're incredibly proud of our role in helping to feed the nation and the world. Any additional cuts to our budget will have impacts on our ability to meet our mission, which means to be able to deliver water and power, not just to cities and rural communities, but also to 1 in 5 farmers in the West.
So if I'm one of those farmers in the West, one of the 1 in 5 farmers, and your budget is slashed the way that our colleagues across the aisle are insisting on doing in exchange for not blowing up the economy, what would be the implication for me as a farmer, as one of those farms that you serve, in the coming years if your agency was gutted to the tune of 20 or 30%?
What we pride ourselves in our mission is to help to provide certainty, especially in light of the changing hydrology. Any cuts to our budget could impact our work, which would provide uncertainty to them. They're already on the margins as far as how they run their projects, and so it would just add to that level of uncertainty.
And would there be an impact on prices for consumers?
That's not in my wheelhouse, but if there's less supply, then certainly an impact on demand.
Less water means less food, means higher prices, means more kids going hungry in my district and in districts across the country. So, listen, we need to invest in modernizing and maintaining water infrastructure across the entire United States, particularly in agricultural regions. It's important for consumers in my district, in Rhode Island, and all across the country. And I would suggest once again to my colleagues here in Congress that if we need to find the funding in order to do that, the way to do it is by asking billionaires and corporations to pay their fair share, not by trying to balance the budget on the backs of consumers who are already paying too much to put food on the table. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Boebert. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Touton, yesterday Interior announced that it was temporarily withdrawing the draft SEIS on the Colorado River Basin's operations, which was published last month, so it can be fully analyzed, the effects of the Lower Basin States proposal under NEPA. Is there an update on the timeline for analyzing this new proposal?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. So we will be suspending the comment period for the existing one. We'll look to this summer to analyze the proposal and then put that out for another comment period so that your constituents, tribal constituents in the states can see the effectiveness of the proposal and then move to finalizing that later this year.
Okay, great, thank you. And the 3 Lower Basin states' commitments to conserve 3 million acre feet of water by 2026 is certainly encouraging, but we definitely need more analysis to ensure that this plan adequately protects Colorado. And the focus must remain on addressing the Lower Basin's continued overuse of the Colorado River water. Do you have current figures with you, or can you get them to me on how many total acre feet of water has been overused by the Lower Basin states? And can you elaborate on the challenge that this is?
We can follow up with figures for you, Congresswoman. I think across the basin there is an imbalance between supply and demand. And so we're working through that with our partners. The Lower Basin took a significant step forward in their consensus proposal, and that's exactly what the whole basin asked us to do, was analyze its effectiveness, which we will.
Okay.
we will
Well, in
do.
Colorado, we certainly have the supply. It just seems the demand is higher, especially when when we are over allocating. So yes, I would love to follow up with you on
Happy
those
to.
figures. And something that's very important to me, Commissioner Towton, the Arkansas Valley Conduit, that will provide just an abundant supply of clean water for 50,000 people in southeastern Colorado. Now, this is a very important project which was authorized more than 60 years ago, as you know. I know this project is also a priority for Reclamation, but will you commit today to continuing to work with local stakeholders and work with me, please, to get the Arkansas Valley Conduit done as soon as possible?
I was so happy to be out in southeastern Colorado to celebrate the groundbreaking of the Boone Reach, and I'm absolutely committed to you, Congresswoman, to
Thank you. I
working
appreciate
through
that. And I would have loved to have joined you. Unfortunately, that was a House session day, so I was here in Washington, D.C. But there was certainly some joy to be had during that day.
Absolutely.
Now, Commissioner Towton, the Upper Colorado and San Juan basins endangered fish recovery programs provide ESA compliance for more than 2,500 water projects in Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming. And overall, these programs have been successful and are a priority for many of the stakeholders. Do you support the reauthorization of these programs?
We have seen the success of these programs, and so that is absolutely a program we support.
And this spring, you issued an environmental assessment for an experiment to address non-native smallmouth bass. The proposed action would have had significant negative impacts to the hydropower resource and the power grid. What was the estimated cost of the proposed action, and would there have been sufficient generation in the West to replace the generation that was proposed to be bypassed all summer?
We recognize that we needed to do additional analysis of its impact, including market analysis, and so that's why we pulled back the environmental assessment. We're doing a full EIS process, and we're working with all the partners, the power users, and certainly our colleagues with Western.
Do you have a timeline on that?
We are looking at that over the next year, but let me follow up with a specific timeline.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. And in the few seconds that I've left, in your written testimony, you have a bullet point about renewable energy, but you go on to almost exclusively talk about hydropower, yet not all hydropower is officially recognized as renewable energy by the federal government. Do you support continuing to expand hydropower and officially recognizing it as a renewable energy source?
We are the second largest producer of hydropower, so we absolutely support the production of hydropower.
All right. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Gallego for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all of our witnesses for your time and perspective today. A special welcome to Mr. LeBeau, and thank you to all of the work WAPA does to bring resilient and affordable power to communities in Arizona. Across the agencies represented here today, the issues addressed in the President's FY24 budget are exactly why I joined this subcommittee, especially in this Congress. There are some of the most dire issues facing the country, and it's important that the federal government solutions be well-funded and forward-thinking. This hearing is especially timely with the announcement yesterday that the Lower Colorado Basin states have reached an agreement on a consensus basis about what we should do for the next couple of years, and thank you for working on that as long as you did. And this is a very welcome update, especially to us in Arizona. I look forward to working with stakeholders and the Bureau of Reclamation in the SCIS process. I do have a couple questions for Commissioner Towton. This budget includes $35.5 million for Reclamation's Native American Affairs programs. Do you feel your department has the resources it needs to adequately engage in tribal consultation with our tribal partners? And what steps are you taking to ensure this?
Thank you. Is that to me, Congressman? Thank you for that question. The $35.5 million is a plus up for us, and certainly that is a program that is utilized by many tribal constituencies. We're also going to leverage the Funding and Inflation Reduction Act provided for tribal assistance to help in those matters. Tribes are an important part of the conversation. They are part of the solution. I was just out last week with Governor Lewis in groundbreaking of the water recycling plant. Right after this flight, I'll be heading to Arizona for more nation-to-nation consultations.
Excellent. And we really do appreciate the nation-to-nation consultation. We really need them as partners, and we should be treating them as partners. I'm very happy to see that that's happening, and they're going to be part of this solution, I think, for us to really survive and thrive in the desert. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes of questions. I want to start with Administrator Hairston. There's rumors going around that the CEQ, that is the Council on Environmental Quality out of the White House, is pushing federal agencies to say they agree on breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams. Have you been, or someone in your agency, to the extent of your knowledge, been contacted by the CEQ regarding the 4 Snake River dams?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. And yes, we are actually part of a process, an FMCS process, which CEQ is heading, that is looking at a long-term durable solution to move us out of litigation around the lower Snake dams. And there's been various items discussed as we've gone through that, and we are scheduled to at least end this first stay of litigation in July, and we'll know a lot more about what the contents of that stay or extended stay might be.
Am I safe in assuming, I'm sure I'm not, but that the BPA is doing its best to defend the continued existence of those dams?
BPA certainly supports the lower Snake dams. They are a valuable part of our asset base. We depend on those assets during particularly peaking periods. I can point to the last couple of heat waves and cold snaps where we've had to call on those dams to help us get through those reliability challenges. So yes, we are very supportive of those assets as part of our portfolio.
And I thank you for that. They're important to the community, obviously, along the river from Idaho through to the sea. So I'm very happy to hear of your support for reasons having to do with power. Also equally important, of course, is freight. Ms. Tooten, I would like to turn our attention to the Colorado for just a moment and the money that's been spent to try to assist in the settlement that's recently, I hope, reached. And can you share with us what part, how big a part, numerically, that portion of the $4 billion in the IRA played in that solution? And how much, in other words, did the IRA factor in when it comes to money paid?
So when the Inflation Reduction Act was enacted, it provided us the authority to find long-term solutions, which we'll be using the bulk of the funding for, as well as bridging solutions to solve in the short term. And so the framework consensus proposed by the lower basin looks at compensation close to $1 billion, but that in the term of the time we're looking at is 3 million acre-feet of water. This amount of reductions have never been done on the river before. So the magnitude of those reductions and that being done voluntarily is a significant step forward for the Colorado River.
How much per acre foot?
It varies. So when you look at long-term contracts, it ranges from $330 to $400, and there's certainly other provisions that we're looking at too. I'm happy to follow up for the record for you.
Is it correct to say that what's really happening is the money is being paid to stop farming and shift that water to cities? Is that correct?
There are cities that also have signed up. Actually, tomorrow we will be signing with the city of Tucson for them to leave water in the reservoirs, as well as the Gila River Indian community who have helped to provide 125,000 acre-feet.
The short question is, are we spending $1 billion to basically place water into cities as opposed to farms? Is that what's happening?
We are looking for sustainability in the system.
Okay, of course we all are, but the question is, are we using that $1 billion to put water into cities?
We're using that water to put water in the system, and that includes sustainability for agriculture.
I'm sure we can look at the agreement and figure it out. Let's move to something like aquifer storage for a moment. Is the department, under your watch, assisting in advancing aquifer storage in California in particular, but across the nation?
Yes.
Because it seems to be one of the most important places we could be spending our time when it comes to storage. And can you share with us whatever you're doing in that space and whatever amount of money is being spent? So we don't have time today to go into any detail, but it's of terrific interest to me, and I think everybody else. So will you provide us with that?
I can, and if I
information?
could just quickly, we have 27 215 flood control contracts in the Central Valley, up to 50,000 acre feet. Some of that will be used for aquifer storage, and $10 million in aquifer storage grants in Del Puerto and current aquifer bank.
Right, thank you, and
Thank
I
you.
appreciate your efforts for the department. With that, I yield back and recognize Ms. Porter for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members from the Colorado River Basin states make up about half of this subcommittee. Republican or Democrat, we all have a shared interest in providing reliable water supplies across the West. We have a shared bipartisan voice that can swing this subcommittee. Unfortunately, we're not using it. In fact, we're about to let something bad happen. We're about to let Reclamation Basin's study program expire in 2023, this year. Commissioner Tootin, what would happen to our Western constituents if we let the Reclamation's Basin Study Program expire?
The Basin Study Program has been a great program for us to work with our constituencies, like in the Colorado River Basin, to identify the challenges they face. It provides really a guiding post of what the challenges are today, but what also we anticipate in the future.
Who are some of the users of the work that the Basin Study Program does?
From on the ground level, certainly our irrigation folks, cities, but also states and tribal entities.
Water districts?
Yes.
We don't have to let politics stand in the way of delivering water to our constituents. Sometimes there are tough choices with water. This isn't one of them. The Reclamation's Basin Study Program should be extended because what it does is provide information for all of the different entities to have informed conversations about how to make use of water. I introduced a bill, HR 3027, to reauthorize, to extend the existence of the Bureau of Reclamation's Basin Study Program. Here's the bill. That's all of it. That's the entirety of the bill. I'll read it to you. To reauthorize funding for the Reclamation, Climate Change, and Water Program. Section 9503F of the Omnibus Public Land Management Act of 2009 is amended by striking 2023 and inserting 2033. Commissioner Tootin, does this bill change the work of the Reclamation Basin Study Program?
It extends our existing program.
Is there anything here that's going to change policy, anything controversial, anything that's trying to lean one way or the other on water policy?
It extends our existing program, Congresswoman.
It extends our existing program. That's it. Chairman Bentz, may I yield to you? Would you be willing to support extending the Reclamation's Water Basin Program for 10 years?
Not without studying it more.
Would you be willing to consider this bill for a future markup?
After discussing the matter with my staff.
Thank you. I yield back.
Do we have any further witnesses? Well, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. Members may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. The first panel is now dismissed. Thank you so much. I will now recognize the second panel of witnesses. The Honorable Martha Williams, Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C. We'll hesitate for a moment while we trade out panels. Okay, we'll start over. I will now recognize the second panel of witnesses, the Honorable Martha Williams, Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Washington, D.C., the Honorable Janie Bavishi, Deputy Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Washington, D.C., and is that it?
Yes, because Mr.
Oh, okay, I see. And we have Mr. Sam Rock standing by. Is that correct? Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow, and at the end of the 5 minutes, the light will turn red, and I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will now recognize Director Williams for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Bentz, Ranking Member Huffman, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Fish and Wildlife Service's fiscal year 2024 budget request. At the Fish and Wildlife Service, we connect people with nature. Our mission is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. Today, I will present our budget request and highlight a few of our programs for which we are seeking additional support. Our greatest asset is our talented and dedicated workforce. They work hand in hand with our partners, amplifying our collective conservation efforts. That's our superpower. That cooperative spirit is found across the service, and one example is the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. Since it began in 1987, the service has helped landowners restore more than 7 million acres of habitat on private lands, leveraging program funding with partner contributions at a 4-to-1 ratio. This year, the service is requesting a $19.5 million increase for the Partners program. These projects not only benefit wildlife, but also provide benefits in local communities through improved drought resistance, water conservation, and wildfire resilience. Another example is our coastal program, which is a voluntary, partnership-driven effort that offers financial and technical assistance for habitat conservation on coastal watersheds. The program leverages partner contributions at a 5-to-1 ratio. In addition to improved habitat for wildlife, these investments in coastal ecosystems bring significant benefits to local communities, including storm resilience and recreational opportunities. The success of these programs shows how our relationships are central to the service's conservation mission, and that this is true across other programs, including migratory bird joint ventures, our fish passage work, and more. Collaboration is also key to the progress we've made in protecting, recovering, and delisting species under the Endangered Species Act. Hundreds of species are stable, recovering, or recovered. For example, 3 months ago, in partnership with the Department of the Defense, we delisted San Clemente's bell sparrow and 4 other species. 2 months ago, after decades of work across the Southeast with state and local partners, we announced our intention to delist the wood stork. We are requesting $88.5 million increase for our ecological services program to build on our success and to help recover species by bringing them back to stable populations or conserve at-risk species. Ecological services is also central to the government's consultation and planning capacity to help deliver infrastructure projects throughout the country. Our employees are always looking for ways to improve efficiency, consistency, and transparency for our consultations. But we are also operating with 20% less staff than we had 2 decades ago. Expanding our workforce capacity will help ensure that the service's consultations are not a bottleneck for projects. As we increase investment in our country's infrastructure, sufficient workforce capacity is even more critical. The good work we are supporting across the country needs to be matched with responsible stewardship of the lands that the service manages. Our refuge system spans more than 850 million acres of lands and waters and includes 568 refuges. The refuge system has grown over time, but over the last 10 years, staffing has decreased by nearly 25%. Our request includes an $83 million increase to help rebuild the workforce of our refuge system. It will ensure that we have the law enforcement officers, visitor services staff, and biologists on hand to properly manage these lands and waters and to be good neighbors to nearby communities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. If enacted, this budget will make a significant difference. I would be pleased to answer any questions that you may have. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director Williams. I now recognize the Honorable Janie Vici, Deputy Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Washington, D.C. for 5 minutes.
Chair Benz, Ranking Member Huffman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the President's fiscal year 2024 budget request for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. For FY24, NOAA proposes a budget of $6.8 billion in discretionary appropriations, an increase of $450.5 million from the FY23 enacted. The FY24 budget builds on investments in the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for climate-ready coasts, climate data and services, and fisheries and protected resources. This budget supports NOAA's goal of scaling up critical efforts to understand and mitigate impacts of the climate crisis. Specifically, NOAA will make investments in research, observations and forecasting, restoration and resilience, offshore wind development, and equity both within the agency and around the nation. It also includes additional investments in our fleet and aircraft, satellites, and space weather observations and predictions to ensure NOAA continues to provide actionable environmental intelligence that is the basis for smart policy and decision-making in a changing world. As we increase our understanding of the changing climate, we will simultaneously research and develop new and improved tools for decision makers to address climate impacts. For example, NOAA will support scientific monitoring and prediction of Arctic systems and ensure that satellite-derived data is provided to users as actionable information. NOAA will also address the ongoing needs identified by the NOAA Alaska Tribal Health Consortium to further develop their tribal climate program and increase support in service to Alaska Natives. In addition, NOAA's research will address challenges faced by commercial fishing and marine resource managers and support tourism and recreation. The NOAA Climate Ready Fisheries Initiative will provide decision makers with climate-informed advice on best management strategies to reduce impacts and increase ecosystem and economic resilience. NOAA will also invest in increasing conservation and protection in an expanded sanctuary system. NOAA's FY24 request will enhance the agency's sanctuary management capacity as new sanctuaries are designated. NOAA will work to identify gaps in marine protection, train the next generation of marine protected area professionals, and expand technology use in sanctuaries to support management priorities. We will continue to foster environmental stewardship and optimize advances in science and technology with a particular focus on the new blue economy. In support of the administration's goal to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore energy by 2030, NOAA will facilitate smart economic and ecological offshore wind development. In FY24, NOAA will continue to work closely with the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, to minimize the effects of offshore energy projects on protected marine resources, fisheries, and important habitats. In addition, this request would help to mitigate impacts to fisheries surveys in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions. NOAA's National Seafood Strategy outlines actions to rebuild and enhance the competitiveness of the seafood and fishing industries and associated communities. NOAA will improve global fisheries management through international negotiations and capacity building, monitor U.S. imports to promote legal and sustainable seafood, and increase enforcement capacity and marine forensics. NOAA continues to prioritize equity in every facet of our mission delivery. In FY24, NOAA will support a diverse domestic seafood sector through a series of workforce development and training programs. Partnerships will cater to diverse and historically underserved communities, including, but not limited to, minority-serving institutions, historically Black colleges and universities, and tribal colleges and universities. Training will focus on the regulations and science that underpin management, which will help improve cooperation and trust among the industry, public, scientists, and regulators. I look forward to working closely with the committee as we develop our science and services in fiscal year 2024 and beyond. And I look forward to discussing NOAA's mission more with you today. Thank you.
I thank the witnesses for the testimony. Before we begin member questioning, I'll note that Mr. Sam Rock, Deputy Assistant Administrator for Regulatory Programs, the National Marine Fisheries Service, will be joining and has joined Deputy Administrator Bavishi for questioning. I will now recognize members for 5 minutes for questions, and we'll begin with Congresswoman Radewagen. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bentz and Ranking Member Huffman, and thank you to the witnesses. Deputy Administrator Bavishi, American Samoa is happily hosting the NOAA ship Rainier this summer, which is our winter, and NOAA does a lot for the coral reefs and the marine environment in my home of American Samoa. But having said that, I wrote to the administration on March 23rd. I wrote the President, the Secretary of Commerce, and the Secretary of Interior about the need to consult with the Pacific Territories more closely on its proposal to create a new national marine sanctuary in the Pacific. I want to thank the administration for listening to my request and our governor's concern on this by scheduling several NOAA outreach meetings with the public in Guam, CNMI, and in American Samoa on this issue, so that all stakeholders in those governments and their affected fishing industries can be heard. I also want to submit for the record a letter by all 3 Pacific Territorial governors in which they raise their concerns to the President regarding this proposed new sanctuary.
Without objection.
I just hope the administration truly listens to the needs that American Samoa has and the devastating effects that a total fishing ban would have on our cannery and the 75% of our exports that depend on it. With growing Chinese influence in the Pacific region, the U.S. must remain focused on countering the PRC attempts to unduly disrupt U.S. territories and the freely associated states, both economically and militarily. My question, Deputy Administrator Bavishi, in addition to the listening sessions in the Pacific Territories NOAA has set, I understand the public comment period closes June 2nd, and my comment is simple. We need some fishing days in the area for our cannery to sustain our island way of life, so could you please provide our stakeholders with an outline and timeline for the NOAA review process on the proposed new Primnim sanctuary after that June 2 date?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman, and thank you for the acknowledgement of the public listening sessions that are happening right now in the region. There's actually one scheduled in American Samoa tomorrow. We will continue to accept comments, as you said, by mail and virtually until June 2nd. After that, we will be considering all the comments and input that we've received, and the timeline will really depend on the volume of comments that we receive from stakeholders through these listening sessions. But I can assure you that the sanctuary process is one that considers public comment very seriously and is very emphasizes public engagement. So we're looking forward to continuing the engagement process and connecting with stakeholders.
Oh, and a special talofa to Sam. Thank you, Deputy Administrator. Your testimony mentions NOAA's national seafood strategy to support our fishing industries by combating IUU fishing and improving fisheries management through international negotiations, monitoring imports, and increasing enforcement capacity, but mentions nothing about food security through securing a domestic supply. Could you elaborate on how NOAA is working on the SIDS, Small Island Developing State designation for the flagged fishing fleet in American Samoa.
Again, thank you for the question, Congresswoman. We recognize that the characteristics of the fleet in American Samoa are similar to those of small island developing states, so we're exploring this designation. We would be happy to follow up with you as we continue to explore this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Williams, last year in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we, of course, authorized and directed historic investments in clean energy, infrastructure, and a clear observation across the partisan spectrum, universal, was that we obviously needed to revisit how we actually permitted those projects. And I think everybody has some interest in fair alterations of the permit. We're certainly in disagreement on how to do it, so let's be under no illusions along those lines. But the necessity of actually trying to accelerate these projects is in everybody's best interest. You have an interest in that. You have a responsibility in that statutorily. And you have proposed, if I understand correctly, that those monies be utilized in part to allow you to modify and streamline and accelerate your own processes. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressman.
Okay. So where exactly does that request to utilize the money to streamline, accelerate fairly your processes enter into your budget? Where is it in your budget, and is that impacted at all by some of the proposed reductions in your budget proposed by the other side?
Thank you for that question, Congressman, and it's in two pieces in our budget request. First, we have a legislative proposal which it would provide for transfer authority from other federal agencies to support what we call Section 7 consultation, and that's the requirement under the Endangered Species Act that the Fish and Wildlife Service consult with the action agency to make sure the proposed actions don't jeopardize a threatened or endangered species. So there's the legislative request, and then very importantly, there's the request for an additional $50.5 million for consultation so that the Fish and Wildlife Service does not become a bottleneck for those very important infrastructure projects to get through.
Okay, and in that regard, of course, people have to do all of that. And I was concerned by your comment there in terms of basic capacity, yes. Which is basic people devoted to the job at hand. Last year, of course, we saw a significant increase after a lot of years of not too many increases in FWS's budget, a lot of which was argued and agreed to on the basis of increased capacity. And so if we then went backwards in time, I assume that that would come out of the actual increase in capacity. So we would end up in a situation where, although we all acknowledge that we've got to apply more capacity to processing approvals and consultations and the other things required by law, we wouldn't have the people to do it with. Is that an accurate way of looking at it?
Yes, Congressman, there's a direct correlation to our capacity to being able to process and streamline any consultation process for those important projects.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ms. Bavishi, sorry, let me turn to the NOAA side of things for a second, and to the Western Pacific Fisheries Management Council in my backyard, who, of course, your own Department of Commerce Inspector General conducted an audit, found improper spending, asked Westpac to basically come up to repay it, the money that was improperly spent. Westpac came back recently and said, well, we can repay it by forgiving it, or we can repay it by taking it out of some future appropriation. Neither of those seem to be a realistic approach to this. We, members of this committee, recently wrote to you and said, that doesn't sound good enough. Find some other solution to hold Westpac accountable for what is obviously clear violations, in my view, of at least understandings of how the law should be applied. What is your response? I know you don't have a formal response, but how do you analyze this? I mean, where can accountability be applied here if the repayments of federal monies, public monies, are not carried out? Then what accountability lies with Westpac? Should the people in charge of making those decisions continue in the Westpac universe?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We received your letter to NOAA Administrator Dr. Rick Spinrad and are working on a detailed response, including right now we're having internal discussions with our general counsel. The letter that we will send back will include an offer to meet with the committee to discuss these issues further.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Lamalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Thank you, panelists, for being with us here today. I wanted to direct the questioning here on a couple of dam removal projects that have occurred up in the state of Washington that, again, were ostensibly for salmon populations. And they had an issue there with sediment on those dams, and I bring this back to the proposal to do this to the Klamath dams, that a high amount of sediment there affected the river negatively, at least for 3 years in that situation in Washington. And one of the differences here, these dams were less than 20 miles from the ocean, so there was at least the opportunity that to have a much simpler ability to flush that sediment there, which was, I think, much higher than projected at the time of removal. So when we switch this back to the Klamath River, the goal, I guess, is that the salmon would be able to travel 200 miles with the dam removal, notwithstanding some of the natural shelves that are there that are being looked past in this removal project. But so in this case, we have the Klamath River, which has naturally a lower flow of warmer water. So the idea is, and this is for Ms. Williams first, Director Williams, why do we believe the salmon would thrive in this sort of environment from a warm lake, a warm river with a much higher amount of sediment having to spread a much farther distance than what was seen on the Glines Canyon and Elwha Dam up north?
Congressman Lamalfa, thank you for that question, and I think it's one of the very privileged and fascinating topics that we get to work on. And I remember visiting, for example, Elwha after the Elwha Dam was removed and saw salmon return there, and how remarkable it is that when you give nature a chance, it's able to heal itself in an incredible way. So yes, indeed, you have asked that there are various ways in which salmon have been able to return when given the opportunity. And so that can be either close to the ocean as they come in or farther in historically when given the opportunity.
I just wonder, though, how do you see success for such a longer distance when an already warmer water environment from the lake and in the river? If the dams are not there creating a cold water habitat, which they do with their depth, certainly that's why they manage Shasta Dam the way they do presently. So I'm wondering how do you arrive at the conclusion that this is going to be a thriving situation for salmon?
Congressman Lamalfa, that is a conclusion that we reach in conjunction with other federal agencies, with states, with tribes, and experts across the board, even within academia. So
okay.
in
Well,
this
that
instance,
doesn't really answer
following
how
the
that
science,
goes. But the situation with the lake is that last year, for example, we have different targets for what the lake elevation should be at the end of the season. And there's a biological opinion that has a lower number than there's an interim operating plan, and then there was an extra tack on that was done at the end. So it's hard to tell, are we managing for suckerfish in the lake? Are we managing for salmon in the river? And in all this managing, even when there was extra water above the level called for at the end of the farming, at the end of the water season last year, the farmers could not tap into an extra approximately 30,000 acre feet that could have helped them finish their crop year with potatoes that were the size of your pinky, and the suffering of those crops. We were earlier in conversation talking about where's our food going to come from, and when we're devastating our food supply. So what are we going to manage for? Is it going to be a deep lake for sucker or the water running down the river for salmon?
Congressman Lamoff, the Klamath does provide, I believe, one of the most challenging situations we all encounter in an ever-increasingly arid West. And so the Klamath, as you are so aware, has experienced extreme drought.
We understand, though, that the Klamath project was created over 100 years ago and made available hundreds of thousands of acre feet of water that was not available, didn't exist for the ability to run it down the river. And that project was created for agriculture solely, not a multi-purpose, multi-use. And so the federal government has gotten away for a long time with taking water that didn't exist, that wasn't for them, and has now just been usurped, that water right. So I would ask you, all of our panelists, to take that thought back. Oregon courts have certainly upheld that. We just haven't fought through here yet. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Magaziner for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for joining us today and for your service. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA play an absolutely essential role in protecting our natural environment, protecting species, and supporting American industry and small business. In my state, the ocean state, Rhode Island, we understand the importance of fisheries to our local economy. We understand the importance of a clean environment to our local economy, to tourism and hospitality, among many other industries. And we understand the importance of finding the right balance between supporting industry, protecting wildlife, protecting the natural environment for the long term. And that is why the work of your agencies is so important. And it is why we as a Congress should support your work. And so I'm glad that in the 117th Congress, this body stood up and committed funding to your agencies to allow you to do their jobs, allow you to do your jobs. And it is why I am disturbed that in the current debt ceiling negotiations, our colleagues across the other side of the aisle are insisting on severe cuts across all categories of spending in exchange for, I guess, not purposefully blowing up the economy, which is what they're threatening. And so I want to dig into that a little more. I also want to note, by the way, another issue of importance to Rhode Island is the promise of offshore wind in meeting our energy goals and creating jobs, reducing emissions, improving the quality of our natural environment. We have some experience with this in our state. We are the home of the first offshore wind farm in the United States. And I have seen projections that offshore wind has the capacity to power at least half of our state's electricity needs by the end of this decade. That is American energy independence, clean energy, and American jobs. But of course, it is important that offshore wind, like any infrastructure, be sited responsibly to minimize the impact on other affected industries and on the natural environment. NOAA has a vital role to play in making sure that these projects move forward in a way that is responsible and impactful. And gutting the ability of NOAA to do its job, to perform the environmental reviews, to perform the reviews on marine life, is extremely counterproductive. And I don't understand how, on the one hand, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are very quick to fearmonger about offshore wind and its impact on the surrounding environment, but then at the same time are trying to defund the very agency that performs the reviews to ensure that we can do these projects in a way that minimizes the impact on local industries and marine life. So my question, Administrator, is if our colleagues across the aisle are successful in cutting agency budgets by 20 or 30%, which is what reverting to fiscal 2022 levels would mean, what would the impact be on your ability to do your job to speed up the permitting process and to make sure that the permitting process is done in a thoughtful and fair way?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. So NOAA has a strong partnership with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, to improve collaboration and processes surrounding the responsible siting of offshore wind. We both consult with BOEM through NEPA and ESA and meet our own permitting requirements through the MMPA and at a coordinated pace. And this is meant to complete environmental review of the FAST 41 offshore wind projects in 2 years. We have been providing BOEM, other federal agencies, states, tribes, other stakeholders on important information on fisheries operations, as well as the potential socioeconomic impacts of offshore wind projects on fishing communities. So just to answer your question more directly, the FY24 President's request includes an additional $39 million for a total of $60 million to expand NOAA's capacity to engage in offshore wind planning, siting, environmental review, and permitting processes to minimize the impact on trust resources and constituencies. These funds will also help NOAA establish a national program to mitigate the effects of planned offshore wind activities on scientific surveys. And finally, the funding will support improvements across regions. For example, in the East Coast as projects enter construction, and also on the West Coast in the Gulf of Mexico as offshore wind leasing processes kick off.
I thank you, and it's very important that we fund you so that you have the ability to do this important work. And I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Congresswoman Hageman for 5 minutes.
Thank you. A couple of months ago, we had the privilege of hearing from Mr. Brian Nesvik, who has almost 30 years of experience in fish and game management, in a WWF subcommittee hearing on my bill to delist the greater Yellowstone grizzly bear. He testified that not only has the greater Yellowstone grizzly recovered far beyond the needed threshold, but they've expanded their range far beyond what is considered suitable by the Fish and Wildlife Service itself. From 1990 to 2020, the area of occupied range of the grizzly has increased steadily at a rate of 4% per year. In 1990, only 230 square miles of private lands occurred within the grizzly bear's occupied range, and by 2020, this range expanded to 4,600 square miles of private lands. This range is larger than Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks and the John D. Rockefeller Parkway combined. In his testimony, Mr. Nesvik said that, quote, their expansion in range into unsuitable habitats has created significant challenges for all states and agencies involved due to the ever-increasing rise in human-bear conflicts potential. Director Williams, considering that the greater Yellowstone grizzly population has been fully recovered for over 20 years, and considering the growing threat to property owners, tourists, livestock owners, and recreationalists, will you support our effort to follow the science and finally delist the greater Yellowstone grizzly from the Endangered Species Act? Yes or no?
Woman Hageman, I will look forward to applying the Endangered Species Act.
That's been done. Do you support delisting the grizzly bear?
Congresswoman Hageman, at the moment, we have approved a finding for the state of Wyoming and are undertaking a 12-month review process to address.
That's been done before.
That's required under the law that we do now. And I would add, as the previous director of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and I was chair of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, I have a tremendous relationship with Mr. Nesvik, have worked with him.
That isn't my question. What I'd really like to get back to is, do you support delisting the grizzly bear?
Congresswoman Hageman, I support delisting the grizzly bear if it is able to meet all 5 factors of the
It already
endangered
has.
species. That includes adequate regulatory mechanisms, which Wyoming knows we
Okay, then let's go on to my next question. As we debated my bill to delist the Greater Yellowstone Grizzly in committee just a few weeks ago, I was surprised to learn that a common objection from the other side of the aisle was their perception of the inadequacy of Wyoming's state management plan. When I responded by describing the success of Wyoming's management of the grizzly at the state level and the fact that we had invested $59 million in protecting the grizzly bear, I wasn't met with any objection because, as it turns out, none of the folks on the other side had read the plan and didn't know what they were objecting to. So my question for you is, Director Williams, what objections, if any, do you have to Wyoming's state management plan?
Congresswoman Hageman, that would be part of this 12-month
Well, do you have any objection to Wyoming's grizzly management plan? I mean, it's been out there for quite some time. It's been available to you. I assume that you've reviewed it. Am I correct or am I incorrect?
You are correct, and there is a piece of the Wyoming management plan which I have discussed with Mr. Nesvik.
What do you object to? What do you object to in the Wyoming grizzly management plan?
Congresswoman Hageman, one of the things we will review as required in the recovery plan for the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is a recalibration issue for which we have been working closely with Wyoming and have a very strong working relationship.
So you don't have anything specific you can point to?
That's part of the reason for a review that's happening right now.
And isn't it true the Fish and Wildlife Service has previously approved the Wyoming grizzly management plan?
I'm not aware of that. I'm not aware of, Congresswoman Hageman, of whether we approve or disapprove the grizzly bear management plan for the state of Wyoming. But we do work very closely with the state and very much appreciate Wyoming's
When will the 12-month
leadership.
review be finished?
We are working on that, and I don't have a date certain.
Well, you have to have a date certain, so then has it not started yet?
It has started, yes.
So then what would be 12 months from the date that it started?
Congresswoman Hageman, it's called a 12-month review.
Oh, but you don't meet the 12-month requirements of the act. Is that your testimony?
Congresswoman Hageman, I did not say that. And it could be shorter or it could be longer to get this done correctly. The point that I care about coming from Montana and along with you and Mr. Nesvik is that we get this right and that we have a defensible
My
rule
time
going
has expired, but thank you.
Thank you, and I now recognize Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to the witnesses. I got several questions, so I will try to make it as fast as I can. First question will be to the Deputy Administrator, because through the fiscal year 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, we reauthorized NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program, and among other provisions. The legislation called for a new National Coral Reef Resilience strategy in providing statutory authority to the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force, and it directed NOAA to provide block grants to states and territories to support coral reef management and restoration efforts. I was proud to support and advocate for this long overdue reauthorization along with Senators Marco Rubio, Congressman Darren Soto, and a bipartisan and bicameral group of colleagues in that sense. Could you provide an update on the NOAA's efforts to implement the provisions of the recently enacted reauthorization of the Coral Reef Conservation Program and how the budget request, if all, support this work?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. NOAA is developing a transition plan and a timeline to address the new provisions in the reauthorized Coral Reef Conservation Act. We have begun drafting a new national coral reef resilience strategy and are communicating with partners about involvement in drafting plans and reporting requirements. There are several new activities in the reauthorized act that will be carried out when appropriations are available to support them. In the meantime, we will provide technical assistance upon request to federal reef managers as they draft coral reef action plans and also
Do you have an idea how long that action plan is going to take, or when we can see, some clear action on that to that program?
I don't have information on the timeline with me right now, but we'd be happy to follow up.
Please do. The other question will be, in the same fiscal year 23, that the disaster relief supplemental bill, we approved and allocated $29 million in supplemental funding for NOAA for expenses related to the 2022 hurricanes and natural disasters, including for marine debris assessment and removal. Early this year, in another subcommittee hearing, I submitted questions about the status of this funding, and in that response, NOAA informed us that it was currently working on finalizing the spend plan. Do we have an update of that, or we're still waiting to have a spending plan?
NOAA's FY23 spend plan is currently in clearance, and once it is available, we would be happy to offer you a briefing and walk through it with you and your staff.
Thank you. Administrator, thank you for being here. You know that we do have 5 refuges in Puerto Rico, national wildlife refuges in Puerto Rico, more than 22,000 acres, including 2 islands, half of 2 islands, Vieques and San Culebra. And then 10 years ago, you used to have 28 employees on the island, and now just 10. My concern is that people are not able to visit many of those wildlife refuge centers because you lack of staff. So what efforts the service is currently pursuing to address staffing needs to improve visitation services in the National Wildlife Refuge in Puerto Rico?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman Gonzalez Colon. I just want to say that I have had the privilege to visit these refuges twice now, especially after Hurricane Irma, to see the impact of the hurricane on Cabo Rojo and the visitor center and the flats there. So your question goes directly to the request, our budget request for increased capacity for our refuge systems so that we can be adequately staffed. And the request is $63 million above the fiscal year 23 enacted level, but that is because our staff for the refuge system is 25% less than it was 20 years ago. Remarkable.
Question. You know that the Cabo Rojo National Wildlife Refuge, it's home to the Cabo Rojo Salt Flats, a system of shallow and hypersaline lagoons that are considered the most important stop power for migratory birds in the Eastern Caribbean. The salt flats are also an important economic asset for the southwestern part of the island, attracting thousands of visitors and supporting a local salt mining operation. Due to the recent storms and seismic activity in the area, the coastal features, the mangroves, dunes, berms, among many others that protected the system has been compromised by erosion, resulting in extensive flooding to the salt flats. And this turn have negatively impacted habitat quality for the viability of the local salt extraction activities. So I know the service secured an initial $1.2 million to implement the necessary restoration efforts, and then an additional $5 million was provided by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation through the America the Beautiful Challenge, which includes funding allocated to the Department of Interior by bipartisan infrastructure law. So this has been a long-standing priority for me and local stakeholders. So I would love to know what efforts the service is pursuing in partnership with local authorities to carry out this program.
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. And as I said, I visited there, a fascinating place where we are working very closely with the operator, the long-standing familial operator of those salt flats, in developing our designs. So we are 75% complete with the project design, working with the partners there. And it's an example, too, I think, of where the investment in this ecosystem restoration and nature-based solutions provides those benefits to the community for flooding and sea level rise. So I look forward to working with you to get this project done.
Thank you. My time expired, but I'll submit other questions for the record. Thank you, Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Congresswoman Luna, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone coming to testify today. Last month, NOAA published a proposed rule entitled "To Establish a Vessel Speed Restriction and Other Vessel-Related Measures to Protect the Rice's Whale." This rule is going to have many adverse impacts on communities, port operations, and the economy in my district, as well as throughout the state of Florida. It includes a year-round 10-knot vessel speed restriction within the waters that are between 100 and 400 meters deep, stretching from Pensacola to Tampa. As you guys know, that's a massive portion of Florida. It also requires an additional 10 kilometers in the areas known as vessel slowdown zones. Additional restrictions within the vessel slowdown zones include no vessel transit at night, a requirement that vessels transmitting through that zone must report their plans to National Marine Fisheries Services, utilize visual observers, and maintain a separation distance of 500 meters from Rice's whales, as well as use and operate automatic identification systems or notify NMFS of transit throughout the zone and report deviations from these requirements to NMFS. Like all Floridians, I believe in protecting Florida's wildlife, especially our threatened and endangered species, but at the same time, we need a common sense solution to ensure that decisions like this proposed rule benefit both wildlife and the industries that operate within the Gulf of Mexico. Unfortunately, this rule would have consequential impacts on the ability of recreational, commercial, and sports fishermen to conduct their businesses, and the impact is not small. In fact, maritime activities in the state of Florida account for about 13% of Florida's GDP and contribute $4.2 billion in state and local taxes. Other industry impacts impacted by this proposed rule include Florida's 16 public seaports and American waterway operators that move cargo between ports in the Gulf of Mexico. My question is for you, Ms. Bavishi. Did NOAA at any point contact stakeholders like these fishermen or waterway operators to discuss the impact this rule would have on their ability to do their work?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I want to clarify that NOAA Fisheries is not proposing an additional vessel speed rule on the East Coast. What actually happened is that we received a petition from multiple NGOs for rulemaking to establish a year-round 10-knot vessel speed limit and other vessel-related mitigation measures in the area referred to by petitioners as Rice's whale core habitat in the Gulf of Mexico.
So just to be clear, you're not proposing that?
That's right. So on April 7th, we published a notice of receipt of this petition and a request for public comments on the petition. This is different from a proposed rule. We will consider all these comments and available information when determining whether to accept the petition and proceed with rulemaking. And industry and anglers can provide public comments on the petition by July 6th of this year.
So as of right now, just to be clear, for those that are interested, you will be open to seeing their positions, and then just kind of where you're at right now, are you waiting to get all of that before you guys decide on how you're going to proceed forward?
That's correct.
Okay. My next question is, just out of curiosity, are you aware of why those NGOs suggested the 10 knots, why not 8 or 12, in regards to that speed limitation?
I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Deputy Assistant Administrator Rob, to answer that question.
Yes, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. We've been exploring the interactions between whales and vessel speed for many years. We've got a rule from 2008 that addresses vessel speed on the Atlantic seaboard, and it sets it at 10 knots because there is scientific information that indicates that a whale may be able to survive a strike if it is 10 knots or less, whereas if it's 10 knots or more, the whale is likely to be severely injured or die. And so that is why it's 10 knots, I presume.
But that's just proposed, it's not official yet, so we can still have people write in if they have different
Yeah, I mean,
opinions.
I should clarify, I do not know why the NGOs chose that number. They have not talked with us about that.
Okay.
I'm presuming they are basing it off of our Atlantic seaboard rule, which is 10 knots. But
Okay.
absolutely, we will take all comments on that.
And just because we're short on time, my last question is for Director Williams. I've in a previous hearing discussed the Sand Key Beach Renourishment Project in my district, and the last update that I received was that USFWS received a request from the Army Corps of Engineers for a consultation on the Sand Key project. Has that happened yet?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. Is this the project that I was so nice to visit with you on the phone? So we
Yes.
did. So that's happened very quickly. I'm glad to hear that, and we will respond immediately if we haven't already.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much. Chairman, I yield my time.
Thank you, Chair recognizes Congressman Mast for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to sit on committee with you all today. I come from T&I and Foreign Affairs, and I think at T&I we do more of drinking from the hose. You guys have a lot better water here than we do, so congratulations on that. Mr. Rock, I would like to speak to you a little bit about something I'm sure you're familiar with, what's known as the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, the project delivery team that National Marine Fisheries Service was a part of, and the recent formal consultation on the Corps of Engineers biological opinion that you all asked to submit to put forward. I think I could safely say that I represent every stakeholder and agency of which FWS was actively involved in this on the project delivery team meetings, and say everybody is pretty pissed off that this whole thing is delayed for months because of just because of National Marine Fisheries, when they basically didn't participate at all between 2019 and now. All of these meetings were online. They were available for people to participate in. Everybody had the ability to hear everybody else's opinions, what they were thinking about. NMFS didn't participate at all, and now you're working behind the scenes with the Army Corps of Engineers. Nobody else knows what in the world you all are talking about. So I have a couple questions that I think a number of stakeholders and agencies would probably like answers to. So just number one, it's this. Can you just give us an update on where NMFS is at in writing their biological opinion?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, I can. I think we have committed to the Corps that we will have a biological opinion to them by June, next month. I think the Corps is now deciding whether or not they want to take that as draft or as final. If it's draft, obviously it might be further delayed as we go back and forth with them, but I think we will be done with our work with a biological opinion that could be final in June.
Can you give us information on what you found in that? Because again, normally, if you were operating as a normal part of the project delivery team, you would be voicing this all to everybody in a public setting, so everybody has comment. They can talk about, hey, is this what you found? Can you answer about this? Can you give us some information on where you're at with this? This shouldn't be secret.
I have not checked with the writing team as to what their conclusions are likely to be. As you may be aware, when an agency consults with us about their project, we either find that it is likely to jeopardize or not jeopardize the continued existence of the species. And if it is a no jeopardy opinion, shorthand term, then we write a biological opinion that indicates that the project as proposed is not likely to jeopardize. I do not know what the potential answer is at the moment. As I said, we still have a month left to go, but we will be consulting with them closely, and if it is anything other than that, we will be talking with the Corps about those actions.
To your knowledge, is NMFS looking to make changes to the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual as has been put forward to this point and agreed upon by basically everybody?
At the moment, Congressman, we have not yet concluded our analysis. We still have a month to go on that, and we're working through that to decide whether or not we would either find that the Corps' actions are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of the species, or if it is likely, what reasonable and prudent measures we would a reasonable prudent alternative we would come out with that would allow them to carry forward their actions and still preserve the species.
Okay. In your comments, you noted in the very beginning when you received an invitation to the project delivery team that basically you weren't going to participate until the very end. I consider that to not be an appropriate way for an agency to operate. It's essentially what your letter says here. I'll submit it for the record if there's not an objection to that. And it says, due to staffing and travel constraints, our heavy involvement in several other U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Water Resource and Development Act, and one federal decision project, our participation may be limited to our review and comment on draft National Environmental Policy Act documents, and basically telegraphing that you weren't going to participate very much. When COVID began, did you all start working from home?
As Congressman, like many federal agencies, we did try to work remotely where we could. Many of our
So is there a reason your folks didn't start attending the project delivery team meetings, which were all remote?
Congressman, as I think the letter indicated, we have staffing resources. We have been struggling to keep up with the pace of infrastructure projects on the coast, this being one of them. It is in part why we've asked in the President's budget for additional resources so that we can better meet these needs and be more responsive. But we are struggling, or had been at the time, to keep up with all the various demands on our time.
I thank you. I thank the chairman for indulging me to join committee.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Congressman Duarte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bavishi, is that correct? Thank you. We've seen the prioritization of fish restoration efforts in the San Joaquin Delta, particularly in California, over responsible management of water resources compounded year after year. We've seen water flush through the Delta to restore salmon runs. We've seen our aquifers depleted, our farm towns left barren, our farm workers left without work. So this has gone on for 6 years. 1.4 trillion gallons of water is one calculation I think is at least reasonable. Enough to sustain 6 million people for 6 years has been flushed out the Delta. What metric do you have to mark the success of the salmon restoration efforts with this expense of our most precious resource? Do we have more salmon now than we did a decade ago?
So as climate change increases the frequency and intensity of drought conditions, we are committed to working with salmon co-managers and water users to develop science-based strategies to provide both short and long-term protections for salmon. I'm going to pass it off to my colleague to talk more about.
It's simple, though. Do you have more salmon now than you did 10 years ago? Because you can't stop climate change by flushing our water out to the ocean. I can nearly guarantee you that. So are these salmon restoration efforts causing us to have more salmon? Because we're devastating irrigated landscapes, we're devastating farm towns, we're devastating our economics. I mean, the gentleman that you're about to pass it off to here is asking for more money, and more money, but we're destroying our rural economy. We're destroying hydroelectric power. We're destroying our irrigated landscapes and other habitats throughout the state, flushing water out to the ocean to restore salmon. Simply, do we have more salmon now than we did 10 years ago?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I think the short answer to that is we still have salmon, and we've suffered through years of record-setting droughts. There are enormous challenges, as you well know. There's not enough water to go around for all the users there. It is in a very important agricultural area, very important to the people in your district and elsewhere in California. There are a lot of demands on the water, and we've been trying to balance all of those demands. I do not believe we have more salmon than we did 10 years ago, but we still have salmon, which is the testament to success of our restoration activities.
So at the southern end of their natural habitat, during climate change, which is beyond our control in many ways, we will do what it takes, including devastating our agricultural economy, devastating rural communities, devastating irrigated landscapes, and devastating our aquifers so that we can maintain some semblance of a salmon population, even if restoration of historic salmon runs is completely out of reach.
We do not believe that it is out of reach. It will take some time to restore salmon to the state that they were in. We do try to balance all the uses, and there is
Thank you. I'll go to Ms. Williams. Ms. Williams, same question on Delta smelt. Have we restored the Delta smelt, or can we find a Delta smelt? We still have salmon at some number. Do we still have smelt?
Congressman, we do still have smelt, and we are working toward being able to captive rear smelt as well.
Very good. These efforts, are they the result of your most sound science, or do they have a lot more to do with serial litigation and settlement of litigation driving your restoration practices and efforts, and your balancing of different competing environmental and human needs for our water resources?
Congressman, I would say that the Fish and Wildlife Service I have always directed as has the secretary and this administration that we follow both the science and the law.
And has serial litigation changed the balance between the science and the law? Is the law always uniform with the science, or do at times you have to do things that are the result of the law in the face of what would otherwise be the best science for restoration, or again, balancing of our precious water resources towards human and endangered species restoration efforts?
Congressman, I would argue that the litigation does not change the science. To some degree, litigation does, the law adapts with litigation, as precedent set standards that we adhere to, but it does not change the science.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Chair. Recognizes Congresswoman Kagans for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to start out with offshore wind, and in pursuit of a all-of-the-above energy strategy. I've been a strong supporter of offshore wind industry, both on the state level and here in Congress, and the hundreds of jobs and low-cost energy it will bring to Virginia's 2nd District that I represent. In the existing lease area off the coast of Virginia Beach, there are currently 2 test turbines in place, with 176 more slated for completion by 2026, almost 15 years after the initial lease agreement was signed. This long-term process has included comprehensive discussions between BOEM, local electricity providers, the Department of Defense, and the fishing community to ensure our national security, economic, and climate goals are all served by the negotiations. The commercial and recreational fishing communities are uniquely impacted by offshore wind and should be consulted every step of the way also as the project continues. So my question is for Ms. Bavishi. You previously touched on the need for the fishing community to be included in negotiations with BOEM. What steps are being taken by BOEM and the National Marine Fisheries Service to ensure our energy needs as well as those of our fishing community are being met?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. We are currently requesting an increase of $32.4 million above the FY 2023 enacted levels to make sure that we ensure that the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic are fully supported to meet the current and future challenges of regulatory and scientific review, and also fund the federal survey mitigation program in the Northeast, West Coast, and Gulf of Mexico and Southeast regions to provide resources and preparations for increased demands in all of these regions. We also in the budget have asked for an increase of $6.2 million under our for the National Ocean Service foundational information for expansion of offshore wind energy initiative to develop the social and ecological science to plan and site offshore wind energy development, including spatial and mapping data analysis and products. And this will also support early engagement in BOEM siting decisions to help reduce conflicts with NOAA trust resources and ocean co-users, and also improve the efficiency of environmental permitting and review processes.
Thank you. And my district is also home to several national wildlife refuges, including Back Bay, Great Dismal Swamp, Chincoteague, and Wallops Island. So thousands of people visit these each year to hike, fish, hunt, camp, and enjoy the outdoors. When the Fish and Wildlife Services announced in September 2022 that they would expand hunting and fishing opportunities at 16 refuges across the country, Chincoteague and Wallops Island were included in the expansion, much to the delight of hunters and anglers in my district. The banning of lead ammunition is projected to raise costs for consumers by as much as 25%, making it too expensive for many people to continue the activity. Instead of expanding access for hunters and anglers, this effort makes it harder for the public to enjoy these opportunities. So, Ms. Williams, will future efforts to expand hunting and fishing across access in wildlife refuges include a ban of lead, tackle, and ammunition? And do you expect this to be standard practice going forward?
Congressman, thank you for asking that question, and I'm so glad that the Fish and Wildlife Service, through the refuge system, could offer these expanded opportunities and increased access, because that remains very important to us. What we are doing with lead now, in part because we received numerous comments over the years who were being responsive to the public, and then also litigation. We are looking at the impact of lead in refuges. We would like to not add additional lead on the landscape, while we work with both the Hunting and Wildlife Conservation Commission and with the states in addressing, probably refuge by refuge, very much in conjunction with the state led and the states on our refuges.
So were there studies done to come to those decisions? Are they still in the process of studying the impact of the lead?
Congresswoman, for any refuge that would not, would change what lead is allowed from now going forward would involve a robust public process, including any impacts to specific species.
Okay, great, thank you. And then just to touch, I know Ms. Luna was talking about NOAA's speed restrictions, but to go back to that, earlier this year, an endangered North Atlantic right whale washed up on the shore of Virginia Beach, and I'm sympathetic to that plight faced by the whales and want to prevent as many deaths as possible. But I'm also concerned that the proposed speed restrictions have gone too far. While undoubtedly well-intentioned in an attempt to prevent whale fatalities, expanding such restrictions would have catastrophic effects on our fishing community in coastal Virginia. I advocated for increased funding for broad deployment of enhanced radar technology on vessels in this year's appropriations package, a strategy welcomed by commercial and recreational fishermen alike, and one that would not immediately cripple the industry. So, Ms. Bavishi, a few questions. When can we anticipate a final rule regarding vessel speed restrictions, and how important are stakeholders' comments gathered during this comment period?
You answer the question for the record, but just one question, please.
Thank you for the question. The public comment period for the vessel speed rule closed on October 31st, 2022. We are reviewing the approximately 90,000 comments that we received, and we anticipate taking final action on the proposed rule this year.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And before I ask my questions, I just want to recognize Kyle Weaver for the record. This is his last meeting. Of course, he's subcommittee staff director and senior policy advisor. He's found a job that won't be half as fulfilling as this one, but perhaps there will be other rewards. Kyle, we'll miss you a lot. You've done a great work for this committee for many, many years, and we wish you the best. So with that, I'm going to ask my 5 minutes of questions. Let me begin by focusing on accountability. And this kind of came up a little bit ago in Congressman Mast's questions. So I'm going to ask each of you, I'll start with Deputy Administrator Bavishi, how you believe that your group is accountable. And I don't need a long answer. I simply want to know what would prompt you as a group, other than perhaps us cutting your budget, to actually move things along with more rapidity. And we'll get to that streamlining question in a minute. I just want to know, what is it that prompts you to actually do things? Is it when the Secretary of Commerce calls and says, hey, get about it? Or is it when people lose all patience, as Congressman Mast illustrated? What is it? And to whom do you believe you are accountable? I don't want a general answer like the American people, don't do it to me, but tell me who.
Well, we certainly are accountable to the American people and federal and taxpayers across the country, but we also have other mechanisms in place that help provide oversight and accountability within the agency.
Please provide those to me. I'm now going to turn to Director Williams, same question.
Thank you, Chair. And I would echo, we are accountable to the American people, and we do have processes in place that I think make sure that we act with integrity.
And then please also provide those to this committee's staff. I would like to see them. I want to turn to, we'll stick with you, Director Williams, for just a moment. I'm looking at your U.S. Fish and Wildlife report, which I have gone through carefully. I'm looking at the first page. First column, about 2/3 of the way down, it says the BIL to FWS to accelerate and improve environmental reviews in support of responsible development of priority infrastructure projects and energy solutions. The phrase accelerate and improve reviews, tell me how you're going to do that.
Chair Bentz, we are doing that in a number of ways. One is we
Can you provide me the list?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I absolutely want to see what we're spending all this money on that's going to make things go more quickly. Let me turn back to Deputy Administrator Bavishi. I've gone through your report not as closely as I normally would have done in my law practice, but what closely, and I can't find much in it about how things are going to be more streamlined. I find an awful lot of words, climate-ready nation whose prosperity, health, security, continued growth benefit from and depend upon a shared understanding of and collective action to reduce, and on, but I see nothing about shortening the time it takes to permit things or make things happen. Tell me how you're going to streamline your $6.8 billion agency.
We have also taken actions, including requesting appropriations in the FY24 budget to help us increase capacity to streamline permitting and review processes. I'm happy to follow up with you to provide more details about that.
Please do, and I look forward to seeing those answers. I have in my hand a memorandum between the Department of the Army Civil Works and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This purports to be, it's dated January 1st, January 5th of 2022, and signed by the Army Corps and Undersecretary of NOAA. It purports not to be an administrative rule, yet what it does is expands dramatically the work that needs to be done when you're trying to simply repair a facility owned by the federal government. Dramatically expands it by looking backwards, forwards, and every other direction, and saying that this is consistent with or a clarification of current rules. I disagree. I've not read this again with the detailed review that I normally would give a legal document of this nature. But I very much want to see something, a legal opinion or something that says this is not an administrative rule. Because despite the footnote on the first page, which assures all of us that it is not, I say that it is. And I very much want to see a legal opinion signed by somebody from your department saying that this is not an administrative rule. And can I get that opinion?
We'd be happy to follow up with that, Chair Benz. I do want to clarify that this MOU was meant to clarify existing regulations and authorities from our respective agencies surrounding ESA Section 7 consultations. It was not meant to impose any new or additional requirements on action agencies or applicants. So it doesn't alter existing requirements related to Section 7 consultation in any way.
And I thank you for that. I look forward to seeing the opinion. And I thank the witnesses for their testimony. And yes, I thank witnesses for the testimony and for the members for the questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5:00 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, May 26th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.